On a warm summer afternoon in July of 1975, a man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions of working-class Americans, a man who had stood toe-to-toe with senators and mob bosses alike, stepped into the parking lot of a quiet suburban restaurant in Detroit. His name was James Riddle Hoffa, better known to the world as Jimmy Hoffa. He was not just another union leader, not just another public figure, he was, in many ways, the embodiment of a certain chapter of American history. To speak of Hoffa is to speak of the struggles of working men, of smoky backrooms where deals were struck, of the uneasy marriage between organized labor and organized crime, and of a mystery so enduring that it continues to fascinate decades later. That July day, as Hoffa waited outside the Machu's Red Fox restaurant, he could not have known that his next steps would lead him into the realm of legend, for he would never be seen again. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa has become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. For some, it is simply an unsolved crime story, a vanishing act carried out with precision and silence. For others, it is a reflection of the way power devours those who wield it too long, a cautionary tale wrapped in intrigue. But to fully understand the enigma of Hoffa's final day, we must first travel back through time, back to the boy who learned to fight on the streets of Indiana, back to the man who rose to command the mightiest labor union in the nation, and back to the enemies he made along the way. Only then can we appreciate why this story grips us even as the decades slip by, like a riddle whispered at night but never solved. Picture, for a moment, the America in which Hoffa lived and thrived. The country was changing rapidly in the middle of the 20th century. Factories roared with the sound of machinery, freight trucks moved goods across states day and night, men labored long hours under harsh conditions, struggling to provide for their families. Against this backdrop, labor unions were not merely organizations, they were lifelines, shields against exploitation, voices for the voiceless. Yet unions were also vulnerable, pulled between the idealism of their mission and the temptations of power and corruption. Hoffa walked that line better than most, balancing loyalty to the working man with dangerous alliances that gave him influence but also placed a target squarely on his back. What makes Hoffa's story so irresistible is not just his disappearance, but the paradox of the man himself. He was loved by many of his rank-and-file members, men who saw him as one of their own, someone who never forgot his roots. He was feared by opponents and rivals, who knew that Hoffa's determination was like iron, unbending, often unforgiving. To some, he was a hero of the working class, a fighter who wrestled dignity out of harsh workplaces. To others, he was a ruthless operator, a man whose deals with the mafia tainted the very ideals he claimed to uphold. Both portraits are true, and therein lies the tension that makes his story linger in the imagination. As the sun sank lower that July afternoon in Detroit, Hoffa grew impatient. He had arranged a meeting with men tied to the very underworld figures he once considered allies. The hours passed, and the ordinary rhythm of the restaurant carried on, cars pulling in, families arriving for dinner, laughter floating from the dining room. To bystanders, nothing seemed unusual. Yet history would record this moment as the last sighting of Jimmy Hoffa. What happened next remains cloaked in silence. Was he lured into a car by men he trusted? Was he ambushed, silenced quickly and efficiently? Was his body buried, burned, or concealed so cleverly that no trace would ever be found? These questions hang in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate. This opening chapter is not just about one man's fate, it is an invitation into a larger journey. Hoffa's life reads like a novel, filled with ambition, power struggles, triumphs, betrayals, and mysteries. It is a story that demands to be told slowly, carefully, with attention to the textures of time and place. Imagine the sound of factory whistles, the feel of worn leather boots on concrete floors, the whispered conversations in late-night diners where men plotted strategies that would ripple across America. Picture also the dim glow of taverns and backrooms where mob bosses leaned in close, their voices low, as they discussed money, loyalty, and control. It was in the space between these worlds, between labor and crime, that Hoffa carved his destiny. And so we begin not with answers, but with questions. Why did Hoffa vanish at the very moment he sought to reclaim his place at the helm of the Teamsters? Who gained from his absence? Why has every search, every investigation, every rumor, failed to uncover the truth? In the stillness of night, as you listen to this story, allow the mystery to settle in. Let the unanswered questions linger like shadows at the edge of memory. For this is not just the tale of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, it is the story of a man who rose from poverty to power, who shaped the fate of millions, and who, in the end, became a ghost wandering through American history. As we move forward, we will peel back the layers of Hoffa's life, tracing his journey from humble beginnings to the heights of influence, and finally to the silence that swallowed him whole. Each step brings us closer to understanding not only what may have happened that July day, but why Hoffa's story still captures our imagination nearly half a century later. For in his rise and fall, we glimpse the eternal struggle between ambition and consequence, loyalty and betrayal, power and the inevitable shadows it attracts. This is where the story begins, with a man standing in a parking lot, waiting for a meeting that would seal his fate. Jimmy Hoffa's story truly begins not with his disappearance, but with his childhood, a boy shaped by hardship, responsibility, and the relentless struggle of the Great Depression. To understand the man who would one day command the most powerful labor union in America, we must first step back into the small towns of Indiana and the working-class neighborhoods of Michigan, where his earliest battles were not fought in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the raw, unforgiving world of survival. James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. His father, John Hoffa, was a coal miner, and the family's life was marked by the harsh rhythms of working-class existence. The mines were dangerous, the pay meager, and the sense of security fragile. When Jimmy was only 7 years old, tragedy struck. His father died of lung disease, leaving the family without its provider. For young Jimmy, the loss was more than emotional, it was practical, devastating, and immediate. With no father to lean on, the burden of survival shifted to his mother and the children, forcing Jimmy into a maturity well beyond his years. It is often said that hardship builds character, and in Hoffa's case, this was more than a proverb. His family moved to Detroit, Michigan, part of the great wave of working-class migration in search of opportunity. Detroit in the 1920s was a city in transition, humming with the energy of the automobile industry but also scarred by poverty. For a young boy without a father, Detroit was both a land of possibility and a battlefield. Jimmy learned early that if he wanted to get ahead, he had to fight, sometimes with words, sometimes with fists, always with determination. Hoffa's mother, Viola, became the rock of the family. She worked long hours, cleaning, cooking, and doing whatever she could to keep food on the table. Watching her sacrifices left a deep impression on Jimmy. He saw the toll that endless labor could take on a person, and he began to understand the larger injustice at play, the way ordinary working people gave everything they had to their jobs, yet remained trapped in poverty. These early impressions would never leave him. They would later fuel his passion for unions, for collective action, and for a life spent fighting, sometimes literally, for the rights of the working man. School was not where Jimmy excelled. He was bright, certainly, with a sharp memory and an instinct for reading people, but he was restless and impatient. Traditional classrooms bored him, and by the time he was in his teens, he had dropped out of high school to work full-time. The Great Depression had settled heavily on America by then, and the need to earn money was urgent. Jimmy found work wherever he could, loading freight, stocking shelves, taking on warehouse jobs that demanded backbreaking labor for little pay. These environments were harsh, often unsafe, and unforgiving, but they also became Hoffa's training ground. He learned how men talked when they were exhausted, how they bonded over shared grievances, and how much they longed for someone to speak for them. Even in his youth, Hoffa displayed a remarkable charisma. He could read a room in an instant, knew when to push a point, and when to back down. He was short in stature, but he carried himself with an intensity that commanded attention. Other young men noticed it. Older men noticed it too. Hoffa wasn't just another teenager hustling for wages, he was a natural leader, someone who could channel anger into action and complaints into strategy. It was here, among crates, loading docks, and warehouses, that Hoffa began to practice the skills that would later make him one of the most influential figures in American labor. One of the defining traits of Hoffa's personality was his refusal to be intimidated. If a boss shouted, Jimmy shouted back. If someone tried to cheat him, Jimmy remembered, and he made sure others remembered too. This reputation as someone who could not be bullied spread quickly. Workers gravitated toward him, instinctively trusting that he would stand up for them. In an age when many laborers felt invisible, Hoffa made them feel seen. He remembered their names, asked about their families, and made their problems his problems. These small gestures planted the seeds of loyalty that would one day grow into an empire. Detroit itself was an important character in Hoffa's early story. The city was a cauldron of energy, cars rolling off assembly lines, unions slowly building strength, immigrants arriving by the thousands. It was a place of opportunity, but also of struggle, where the gap between the wealthy industrialists and the working poor was stark. For someone like Hoffa, who had felt poverty so directly, this imbalance was intolerable. He saw men breaking their bodies for companies that discarded them like worn-out tools. It was here that Hoffa's sense of justice was sharpened, not abstract justice in books, but real justice, measured in wages, hours, and dignity on the job. As Hoffa entered his late teens, he was already developing the toughness that would define him. He was not afraid of physical confrontation, and he carried himself with a confidence that made even older men take notice. Yet, alongside this toughness, there was a warmth that drew people in. Hoffa could laugh, share stories, and put people at ease. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the working-class man, tough when needed, but always ready with a handshake and a joke. This duality, hard and soft, feared and loved, would become one of the central contradictions of his life. By the time he was in his early 20s, Hoffa had already lived a life that taught him resilience, loyalty, and the importance of standing together. He understood poverty, he understood work, and he understood people. These early lessons would serve him well as he stepped onto the stage of labor organizing. He was not entering it as a scholar or politician, but as someone who had carried the weight of crates, felt the ache of long shifts, and known the fear of job insecurity. When Hoffa spoke, workers believed him, not because he was eloquent, but because he was one of them. The story of Jimmy Hoffa's childhood and early years is not just background, it is the foundation of everything that followed. Without the hardships of Indiana, without the migration to Detroit, without the endless grind of Depression-era jobs, Hoffa might never have developed the grit, empathy, and determination that defined his career. These were not abstract lessons, but lived experiences etched into him like scars. They created a man who would rise not because he sought glory, but because he refused to be broken by the same forces that broke so many others. And so, as we leave this chapter of Hoffa's early life, we see the outline of a destiny beginning to form. A boy without a father, raised in poverty, working long hours from a young age, this was the soil from which a labor leader would grow. Hoffa's fight was not yet fully in view, but the fire was already burning. He was ready to step into the world of unions, ready to find not just a job, but a mission. In the dim light of warehouses and the long shadows of Detroit streets, Jimmy Hoffa was preparing for the battles that would make his name echo across America. The turning point in Jimmy Hoffa's life came not through a grand decision or dramatic announcement, but in the quiet, grinding reality of warehouse work. It was the 1930s, and Hoffa was still a teenager, laboring for a grocery chain called Kroger. He spent his days hauling crates, moving perishables, and working in conditions that were neither safe nor humane. Wages were low, hours were long, and the demands placed on workers were relentless. The men on those docks were often treated as replaceable, tools rather than people. But what set Hoffa apart was that he did not simply endure this life, he observed it, questioned it, and resolved to change it. The first significant step came during a dispute over working conditions at Kroger's warehouse. The company had a reputation for exploiting its employees, pushing them past their limits with little regard for safety or fairness. For most workers, complaining felt futile, supervisors held the power, and replacements could be found easily. Yet Hoffa saw something others didn't, the potential strength of unity. Alone, a worker could be fired for speaking up. Together, a crew could demand respect. Hoffa's opportunity arrived with a simple but daring act of defiance. One day, he and a group of fellow employees were asked to unload a truck under particularly unfair terms. The company had cut corners, demanding extra labor without proper pay or conditions. Hoffa, recognizing the injustice, encouraged his colleagues to refuse. It was a small-scale protest, but in its success lay the seeds of something larger. The men stood together, and the company, caught off guard by their solidarity, relented. For the first time, Hoffa tasted the power of organized resistance, and he liked it. This moment became the foundation of Hoffa's early reputation as a leader. He had not been appointed to any position, nor given authority by anyone. His authority came from the workers themselves, who trusted him to speak when they could not, to take risks they were too fearful to take alone. Hoffa's courage resonated with men who were tired of being silenced. He demonstrated that leadership wasn't about titles, it was about action, about standing up in the face of unfairness and not backing down. From there, Hoffa's involvement in labor organizing deepened. He became more active in speaking with fellow workers about their grievances, listening carefully, and building consensus. He discovered he had a gift not just for confrontation but for persuasion. He knew how to make men feel heard, how to validate their struggles, and how to turn frustration into collective resolve. In many ways, he was practicing the very techniques that would later make him a national figure, an instinctive ability to blend toughness with empathy, to balance confrontation with camaraderie. The 1930s were a fertile ground for labor activism. Across the country, unions were growing stronger as workers sought protection during the harsh realities of the Depression. Yet the Teamsters, the union that would become Hoffa's life, were not yet the monolith they would become. At that time, they were still consolidating power, growing steadily but struggling with corruption and internal rivalries. Hoffa's entry into this world was not through official channels, but through practical necessity. His first taste of collective action at Kroger had awakened something in him, and soon he began aligning himself with local Teamsters who were pushing to expand their influence. What made Hoffa effective in these early stages was his complete identification with the workers he represented. He was not an outsider or an intellectual theorizing about labor rights. He was one of them, sweating beside them, hauling boxes, dealing with aching muscles at the end of a shift. When he spoke about unfairness, it wasn't an abstract principle, it was his life. This authenticity made him magnetic. Men trusted Hoffa because he wasn't asking them to fight a battle he wasn't willing to fight himself. But Hoffa's path into organizing was not without danger. Employers at the time were quick to use intimidation and even violence to suppress union activity. Strikes were often met with police batons, private security forces, or hired thugs. Hoffa, still young, understood this risk but pressed forward anyway. In his eyes, fear was a tool used to keep workers silent, and silence was no longer acceptable. His defiance, even at this early stage, hinted at the resilience that would later define him in battles against far more powerful adversaries. It was also during these years that Hoffa began honing his negotiating style. He understood that confrontation had its place, but so did compromise. He was not reckless. If he could win gains for workers without provoking unnecessary retaliation, he would. Yet he was also unwilling to settle for crumbs. Hoffa had a sharp instinct for when to push and when to step back, for when anger could be weaponized and when it needed to be tempered. This balance would become the hallmark of his leadership, always tough, but rarely reckless. Beyond tactics, Hoffa's charisma played a crucial role. He was known for his sharp memory, often recalling personal details about men and their families, which made them feel valued. He could deliver speeches that stirred emotion, but he was equally adept at one-on-one conversations that built trust. He was relentless in his work, often spending long hours listening to grievances, planning strategies, and building networks. Even in these formative years, his energy seemed boundless, a man who lived and breathed for the cause of labor. Detroit in the 1930s was also a city deeply influenced by organized crime, and although Hoffa's early steps into union organizing were rooted in genuine worker struggles, it would not be long before the shadow of the underworld began brushing against his path. Trucking was an industry ripe for both unionization and mob influence, and the lines between legitimate organizing and illicit deals were often blurred. Hoffa's first brushes with the Teamsters placed him at the edge of this intersection, a space where labor needs and criminal opportunity overlapped. Though in these early years Hoffa was still more a young activist than a power broker, the environment foreshadowed the alliances and compromises that would shape his career. Looking back, it is remarkable how quickly Hoffa transitioned from being a frustrated young worker to an emerging labor leader. The lessons he absorbed during these years would guide him for decades to come. He learned that unity was stronger than fear, that leadership was earned through action, and that even the most intimidating adversaries could be challenged if men stood together. He also learned that power, once grasped, had to be defended constantly, that victories could be fleeting if not reinforced by loyalty and vigilance. By the end of the 1930s, Hoffa was no longer just another laborer on a warehouse floor. He had become a trusted figure in his community of workers, someone who had proven his ability to fight and to win. The young man who once carried crates and endured poverty now carried something else, a growing sense of destiny. The Teamsters would soon become his stage, and Hoffa was ready to step into the spotlight. The boy shaped by hardship and the young man forged by labor disputes was evolving into something larger, a force that could not be ignored. As this chapter of Hoffa's life closes, the threads of his future are already visible. The same qualities that made him stand out at Kroger, his courage, his defiance, his empathy, his tactical mind, would soon propel him into the heart of America's labor movement. The stakes would rise, the challenges would multiply, and the enemies would grow more formidable. But the essence of Jimmy Hoffa, the fighter who saw injustice and refused to accept it, was already firmly in place. His first steps into union life were not tentative. They were bold strides toward a destiny that would forever change the landscape of labor in America. By the time Jimmy Hoffa reached his early 20s, the Teamsters were no longer just an idea on the horizon, they were a living force that was slowly expanding across the nation, and Hoffa was finding his place within their ranks. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, once a modest organization of horse and wagon drivers, had grown into a union representing truckers in a rapidly industrializing America. In Detroit, where factories hummed and warehouses bustled, the Teamsters were gaining ground. For a young man like Hoffa, who had already proven his natural leadership on the docks, this was more than a union, it was an arena where he could test and sharpen his skills, a platform to transform his restless energy into something larger. What made Hoffa's rise so swift was his uncanny ability to connect with workers at the ground level. Unlike some union officials who operated from offices or distanced themselves from the everyday struggles of their members, Hoffa remained firmly planted in the trenches. He could walk into a warehouse or step onto a loading dock, and within minutes he had the men's attention. His style wasn't polished or academic. He didn't rely on lofty speeches filled with abstract ideas. Instead, he spoke plainly, with the cadence of the men themselves, using their language, their humor, and their frustrations. This relatability was magnetic. To the workers, Hoffa wasn't just representing them, he was them. One of the defining traits of Hoffa's early organizing was his hands-on approach. He wasn't afraid to get dirty, both literally and figuratively. He worked alongside the men, earning credibility not through words alone but through action. He listened with remarkable attentiveness, remembering details of people's lives and weaving them into conversations later. A man would be stunned to hear Hoffa recall the name of his child or mention something about his family weeks after their first meeting. This attention to personal detail created loyalty, because Hoffa made people feel valued in a way few leaders could. But Hoffa was more than just personable, he was strategic. He had a keen sense of timing and negotiation. He understood that to build a strong union base, workers needed victories they could see and feel. Even small gains, a pay raise, a shorter shift, safer conditions, were stepping stones toward greater solidarity. Hoffa was tireless in pursuing these victories, often staying up late into the night planning strategies, meeting with workers in diners, or hashing out tactics over coffee in smoky union halls. He lived and breathed organizing, and his intensity inspired those around him. The 1940s were a critical decade for the Teamsters, and Hoffa's influence grew steadily. He became closely involved with Local 299 in Detroit, one of the most important chapters in the union. Local 299 represented drivers and dockworkers in a city that was vital to the nation's wartime economy. Detroit was the arsenal of democracy, producing automobiles, tanks, and war materials during World War II. Trucks were the veins that carried these supplies, and the men who drove them held immense, if often unrecognized, power. Hoffa saw this power clearly. He knew that the ability to stop or slow the flow of goods gave workers leverage that could not be ignored. It was in Local 299 that Hoffa's leadership became undeniable. He organized strikes, not recklessly, but with careful calculation. He knew how to apply pressure on employers without pushing so far that the government would intervene harshly. His strikes were disciplined, and he enforced that discipline with an iron hand. Workers respected Hoffa not only for his toughness against employers but also for his toughness within the ranks. If a man broke solidarity, Hoffa dealt with it directly. He believed unity was the only weapon they had, and he would not allow it to be weakened. This uncompromising stance built trust. Men knew that if Hoffa promised to fight for them, he would, fiercely, relentlessly, and without hesitation. At the same time, Hoffa was cultivating relationships outside the shop floors. He was learning the art of backroom negotiations, meeting with employers, politicians, and other union figures. His charisma extended beyond the rank and file. He had a way of winning over even those who opposed him, or at least forcing them to respect him. Hoffa's reputation grew as someone who could not be easily intimidated. Employers realized that he was not a man to be brushed aside. If they underestimated him, they did so at their peril. Yet Hoffa's rise was not without controversy. As the Teamsters expanded, the lines between legitimate union organizing and the influence of organized crime began to blur. Detroit, like many industrial cities, was home to both union activism and underworld activity, and the two often overlapped in the trucking industry. Employers sometimes hired mob muscle to break strikes, unions sometimes turned to the mob for leverage of their own. Hoffa, pragmatic by nature, saw these forces as part of the landscape. While he had not yet fully entered into deep alliances with organized crime, the seeds were being planted. To Hoffa, the world was not divided neatly between right and wrong, it was divided between strong and weak, winners and losers. His goal was always to make sure his side was the former. Hoffa's charisma and tactical brilliance propelled him into leadership roles within the Teamsters, first at the local level and eventually on the national stage. But even as he climbed, he never lost his grounding with the workers. He continued to attend meetings, to listen, to remember names and faces. His connection with the rank and file was his greatest asset, and he guarded it carefully. Workers felt he was accessible, that he had not become a distant figurehead. This bond created loyalty so deep that it bordered on devotion, a loyalty that would sustain him in the years ahead, even when scandal and prosecution loomed. By the late 1940s, Hoffa was not just a local leader, he was a rising star within the entire Teamsters organization. His combination of toughness, charisma, and strategic vision marked him as someone destined for the top. But more than that, Hoffa represented something workers longed for, a leader who would not betray them, who would fight tooth and nail for their interests, and who would not back down from anyone, be it an employer, a rival union leader, or even the federal government. The stage was set for Hoffa's national prominence. His rise in the Teamsters was not meteoric in the sense of sudden fame, rather, it was the steady, relentless climb of a man who simply refused to quit. Each victory, each strike won, each negotiation settled on favorable terms added another brick to the foundation of his power. By the time the 1950s dawned, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just a figure in Detroit, he was becoming a name known across the country, a man whose influence was growing as fast as the trucks that roared down America's highways. And yet, with this rise came shadows. The higher Hoffa climbed, the more attention he attracted, not just from workers who admired him, but from rivals who feared him, employers who despised him, and government officials who began to wonder what kind of man was wielding such power. For now, though, Hoffa's rise seemed unstoppable. He had found his calling, and nothing, at least not yet, appeared strong enough to stand in his way. The 1950s marked a turning point in Jimmy Hoffa's story, a decade in which his influence stretched beyond Detroit and into the very core of the Teamsters Union, while his associations with figures outside the law began to raise questions that would follow him for the rest of his life. By this time, Hoffa was not just a promising leader, he was a force, someone whose presence in any room shifted the balance of power. Yet, as his star rose, so too did the shadows that gathered around him, for Hoffa's pragmatism, his relentless drive, and his thirst for control drew him into dangerous alliances with organized crime. To understand how Hoffa became so deeply entangled with the mob, one must first recognize the climate of post-war America. The trucking industry was booming, and the Teamsters Union was poised to control the arteries of commerce itself. Trucks delivered everything from food and clothing to steel and war materials, they were the veins of the American economy. With such power concentrated in one union, employers often resisted fiercely, and local officials, many of them corrupt, sought to exploit the situation. Into this volatile mix stepped organized crime, which had long seen labor unions as an opportunity, not just to control jobs and contracts, but also to launder money, skim pension funds, and extend influence into legitimate industries. Hoffa, always practical, never saw things in simple moral terms. His focus was singular: protect his men, strengthen the union, and win battles against employers who would otherwise crush them. To him, if working with underworld figures could help him achieve those goals, it was not a betrayal, it was simply another tool. He often framed these alliances as necessary evils, though in truth, Hoffa's personality made him a natural at navigating such relationships. He was tough, fearless, and unyielding, the very qualities that mob leaders respected. By the early 1950s, Hoffa was climbing higher within the Teamsters, earning a reputation as the union's most effective organizer. He was building alliances across different regions, making himself indispensable to the national leadership. Yet behind the scenes, he was also cultivating relationships with figures connected to organized crime in Detroit and beyond. These relationships weren't purely personal, they served mutual interests. The mob provided muscle, intimidation, and financial resources. Hoffa provided access, influence, and legitimacy within one of the most powerful unions in America. One of the key areas where this cooperation flourished was in labor peace, or, more accurately, the control of labor unrest. Employers dreaded strikes, which could shut down entire industries. Mob-connected intermediaries would often offer solutions to these problems, ensuring cooperation or quelling dissent. Hoffa's ability to guarantee such outcomes, with the backing of organized crime, made him a man of enormous leverage. It was a dangerous balancing act, but Hoffa thrived in such environments, seeing opportunity where others saw risk. The union's pension fund also became a focal point of this uneasy alliance. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, fueled by the contributions of hundreds of thousands of workers, grew into a financial juggernaut worth millions of dollars. For Hoffa and his allies, it represented both power and temptation. While the fund was intended to provide security for retirees, it also became a source of loans for mob-backed ventures, casinos, hotels, and construction projects. Hoffa, who believed in using every resource available to expand the union's influence, sanctioned these dealings, rationalizing that they kept the union strong while also rewarding those who supported it. This merging of union strength and mob connections made Hoffa a figure who straddled two worlds. To his men, he remained the tireless defender of the working class, the leader who remembered their names and fought their battles. To the mob, he was an ally who could open doors to vast sums of money and influence. To the government, however, Hoffa was becoming a troubling figure, a union boss whose reach extended so far that it challenged the balance of power between labor, business, and the state itself. Hoffa's rise during this period was cemented by his iron grip on discipline within the Teamsters. He demanded loyalty, both from his workers and his lieutenants, and he was not afraid to use strong-arm tactics to enforce it. Violence, intimidation, and coercion became tools in his arsenal, though Hoffa himself often presented these methods as simply business. He did not view himself as a criminal, rather, he saw himself as a warrior in a brutal system where only the strongest survived. If fists or threats were required to protect his people, then so be it. By the mid-1950s, Hoffa was more than just a rising star, he was poised to take over the Union itself. His alliances, both legitimate and illicit, ensured that he had the backing necessary to make a bid for national leadership. But with greater power came greater scrutiny. Journalists began to investigate the Teamsters' connections to organized crime. Senators and government officials took notice, and soon, Hoffa's name was being whispered not just in union halls and mob hangouts, but in congressional corridors. Yet Hoffa remained undeterred. His confidence bordered on audacity. He famously claimed that no force, not the government, not rival unions, not the mob itself, could unseat him from power once he secured it. In many ways, he was right. Hoffa had created a web of loyalty so intricate, a base of support so deeply rooted, that he seemed untouchable. The men who drove the trucks, loaded the docks, and moved the goods of the nation trusted him absolutely, even as rumors swirled about corruption and mob ties. This period of Hoffa's life, when his rise intersected with the shadows of organized crime, set the stage for the battles that would dominate the rest of his career. He had built an empire of influence, but he had also attracted powerful enemies, rival union leaders who resented his dominance, employers who despised his methods, and government officials who viewed him as a threat to law and order. The alliances that had fueled his success would, in time, contribute to his downfall. But in the 1950s, those dangers still seemed distant. Hoffa was a man at the height of his powers, a leader who had transformed himself from a poor kid on Detroit's docks into a national figure commanding respect, fear, and loyalty in equal measure. He was a man who could walk into a warehouse and win hearts with a smile, then walk into a backroom and strike deals with men whose hands were stained with blood. To his followers, Hoffa was invincible. To his enemies, he was a growing storm. And to history, this was the decade when Jimmy Hoffa became more than a union boss, he became a legend. By the late 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa's name was no longer confined to union halls or the industrial heart of Detroit. It had become a fixture in newspapers, on radio broadcasts, and in whispered conversations among politicians. His growing power within the Teamsters, combined with persistent rumors of mob ties, was attracting the attention of a formidable adversary, the United States government. At the forefront of this attention stood a young, ambitious senator named Robert F. Kennedy, whose determination to root out corruption in labor unions would transform Hoffa's life into a battleground of subpoenas, hearings, and televised confrontations. The clash between Hoffa and Kennedy was not a simple legal struggle, it was a clash of personalities, ideologies, and egos. On one side stood Hoffa, the street tough, fiercely loyal, and unapologetically pragmatic union boss. On the other stood Kennedy, the idealistic, sharp-minded lawyer with a burning sense of justice, unshakably convinced that men like Hoffa were poisoning the integrity of America's labor movement. To the public, it was a drama as gripping as any boxing match, two men who despised one another, circling, trading blows, each determined not to yield an inch. The stage for this confrontation was set with the creation of the McClellan Committee, officially known as the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field. Beginning in 1957, the committee launched a sweeping investigation into corruption within labor unions, with Robert F. Kennedy serving as its chief counsel. The hearings were broadcast across the nation, turning union corruption into a matter of public spectacle. Millions of Americans, sitting in their living rooms, watched as senators grilled union leaders and witnesses, exposing shocking stories of embezzlement, violence, and mob involvement. For Hoffa, who was by then rising toward the presidency of the Teamsters, the committee posed a direct threat. Yet in typical Hoffa fashion, he did not retreat. Instead, he relished the fight. He saw the hearings not only as a test of his resilience but as an opportunity to display his toughness. When summoned to testify, Hoffa did not tremble under the bright lights of television cameras or the sharp questioning of Robert Kennedy. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smiled, and parried questions with the wit and defiance of a man utterly convinced of his own invulnerability. The exchanges between Hoffa and Kennedy became legendary. Hoffa would smirk, interrupt, or twist questions back on his interrogator, often infuriating Kennedy. The young lawyer, with his stern demeanor and rapid-fire questioning, found himself exasperated by Hoffa's slipperiness. Viewers at home were captivated by the duel, Hoffa, the defiant Union man who refused to be cowed, and Kennedy, the relentless prosecutor who seemed determined to crack him open. Their rivalry became so heated that it transcended politics, becoming personal. Kennedy reportedly once told his colleagues that his mission in life was to put Jimmy Hoffa behind bars. Behind the bravado, however, Hoffa understood the stakes. The McClellan hearings weren't merely about public perception, they were uncovering real evidence of corruption and organized crime infiltration in the Teamsters. Witnesses testified about union funds being funneled into mob-controlled enterprises, about violence used to silence dissent, and about Hoffa's own involvement in questionable dealings. Though Hoffa denied wrongdoing at every turn, the mounting scrutiny cast a long shadow over his leadership. Yet paradoxically, the government's pursuit of Hoffa only seemed to strengthen his image among his base. Many rank-and-file Teamsters saw the hearings as political theater, designed to weaken the Union and strip them of their hard-won power. To them, Hoffa's defiance was inspiring. Here was a leader who stood up to senators, lawyers, and even the Kennedy family itself without blinking. Each time Hoffa sparred with Robert Kennedy on national television, his legend grew among the working men who admired his guts. In a way, the government's assault reinforced Hoffa's role as the protector of his members, the man who would fight anyone, anywhere, to defend them. Still, Hoffa's growing profile made him a marked man. The more he resisted, the more determined Kennedy became. The hearings uncovered enough evidence of corruption to justify further investigations, and soon Hoffa was facing multiple indictments on charges ranging from bribery and jury tampering to misuse of union funds. While Hoffa managed to beat many of these charges, thanks to savvy lawyers, loyal allies, and, critics alleged, witness intimidation, the cloud of suspicion never lifted. The Kennedy-Hoffa rivalry reached its most dramatic point when John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, with Robert appointed as Attorney General. This meant that Hoffa's fiercest enemy now held one of the most powerful law enforcement positions in the nation. For Hoffa, this was no longer just a series of hearings, it was a war. Robert Kennedy established the Get Hoffa Squad at the Justice Department, a special task force dedicated entirely to investigating and prosecuting the union boss. The government's resources, FBI agents, prosecutors, investigators, were aimed like arrows at Hoffa's heart. And yet, Hoffa seemed undeterred. In fact, in 1957, even amid the swirl of accusations, Hoffa achieved his greatest victory: he became president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. With nearly 2 million members, the Teamsters had grown into the largest labor union in the United States, and Hoffa was its undisputed ruler. His election was a triumph not only over his internal rivals but also over the growing pressure from government forces. As he stood at the podium during his acceptance speech, Hoffa seemed unstoppable, a man who had climbed from poverty on Detroit's docks to the top of one of the most powerful organizations in the country. Still, shadows lingered. The government's pursuit did not abate, and the Teamsters under Hoffa became a lightning rod for controversy. His enemies argued that Hoffa had transformed the union into a personal empire, enriched by mob money and enforced by intimidation. His supporters countered that under his leadership, the Teamsters had secured higher wages, better pensions, and improved working conditions for millions of families. Both were true, and that contradiction was at the core of Hoffa's story, a man who brought undeniable gains to his members while blurring the line between legitimate labor advocacy and criminal enterprise. By the end of the 1950s, Hoffa's position was stronger than ever, but the battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Hoffa, bolstered by his members, protected by mob allies, and confident in his ability to outwit the system. On the other stood Robert Kennedy and the federal government, armed with the law, relentless in their determination to bring Hoffa down. What began as a series of televised hearings was evolving into a struggle that would dominate the next decade, a struggle that would test Hoffa's resilience, expose the darkest corners of the Teamsters, and eventually alter the course of American labor history. For now, though, Hoffa reveled in his victories. He had stared down senators, faced the scrutiny of millions watching on television, and still emerged with more power than ever before. The dock worker from Detroit had not only risen to the top of the Teamsters but had also become one of the most recognizable, and polarizing, figures in America. Yet even as he smiled for the cameras and basked in the applause of his union brothers, a storm was gathering, a storm led by Robert Kennedy, who would stop at nothing to see him fall. Jimmy Hoffa's election as president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957 marked the peak of his influence and the beginning of a reign that would change the very nature of organized labor in America. With nearly 2 million members under his leadership, Hoffa commanded a union that stretched from coast to coast, controlling the arteries of American commerce. Trucks carried goods across every highway, dockworkers loaded ships in every port, and warehouses bustled with activity, and Hoffa, at the head of the Teamsters, had leverage over it all. It was a position of enormous power, and Hoffa relished it. Yet with this triumph came a tightening of the noose, government investigations, mob entanglements, and growing paranoia that would shape the rest of his career. From the moment Hoffa took office, he set about consolidating his control with characteristic determination. The Teamsters were not merely a union, they were, under Hoffa, a machine. He centralized authority, rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent with an iron hand. Local leaders who opposed him often found themselves marginalized, ousted, or pressured into compliance. Those who stood with him, however, enjoyed his protection and the benefits of being aligned with the most powerful labor boss in the country. Hoffa's genius was not only in organizing workers but also in organizing power itself, weaving an intricate web of alliances that bound the union tightly to his command. Financial resources were key to this consolidation. The Teamsters Pension Fund, known as the Central States Pension Fund, grew into a financial powerhouse during Hoffa's tenure. On paper, it was designed to safeguard the future of millions of workers, ensuring retirement security for men who spent their lives hauling goods across the nation's highways. In practice, however, the fund became one of the most influential pools of money in America, money that could build hotels, bankroll construction projects, and even shape entire industries. Under Hoffa's direction, loans from the fund often went to ventures backed by organized crime. These deals blurred the line between legitimate investment and outright corruption, but Hoffa rationalized them as mutually beneficial. The union profited, the mob profited, and the projects created jobs for his members. It was during this time that Hoffa's alliances with the mafia became most pronounced. The mob saw in the Teamsters a golden opportunity, an organization with access to billions of dollars and the ability to influence every corner of the economy. Hoffa, in turn, saw the mob as useful allies who could provide muscle when needed and ensure labor peace in industries plagued by conflict. The relationship was not one of subservience. Hoffa was too proud and too strong-willed to play the role of puppet. Instead, it was a partnership built on mutual interest. Mob bosses respected Hoffa's toughness and his refusal to back down. Hoffa, for his part, respected their discipline and their ability to get things done. But these relationships came at a cost. The more Hoffa leaned on organized crime, the more ammunition he handed to his enemies. Robert Kennedy, now serving as Attorney General, intensified his pursuit. The Get Hoffa squad worked tirelessly to build cases against him, combing through records, interviewing witnesses, and surveilling his activities. To the Justice Department, Hoffa was not merely a corrupt union leader, he was the embodiment of the unholy alliance between labor and organized crime, a symbol of everything they sought to eradicate. Hoffa, however, remained unbowed. If anything, the government's relentless pursuit only strengthened his resolve. In speeches to his members, he portrayed the Kennedys as elitists who sought to weaken working men by attacking their leader. He reminded them of the gains the Teamsters had made under his rule: higher wages, better pensions, improved conditions. "They're not after me," he would say in essence. "They're after us." This framing resonated deeply with his followers, many of whom viewed the government as an adversary rather than a protector. To them, Hoffa was not a criminal, he was their champion, standing tall against a hostile system. Still, beneath the defiance, Hoffa grew increasingly paranoid. He understood the forces aligned against him and knew that every phone call, every meeting, might be monitored. He surrounded himself with trusted lieutenants and demanded absolute loyalty. He also cultivated an image of accessibility, continuing to meet with rank-and-file members, shaking hands at truck stops, and listening to their stories. This dual strategy, projecting strength while reinforcing personal connections, kept his base loyal even as the walls closed in. Hoffa's consolidation of power extended far beyond his own union. He sought to expand the Teamsters' reach, forming alliances with other unions and exploring ways to extend influence into industries where the Teamsters had little presence. He dreamed of building a labor empire so vast that no politician, no employer, and no government agency could challenge it. His ambition was as boundless as his confidence. But the Kennedys were not his only enemies. Within the labor movement itself, Hoffa's dominance bred resentment. The AFL-CIO, America's largest federation of unions, expelled the Teamsters in 1957, citing corruption and mob ties. To Hoffa, this was little more than political theater, but it isolated his union from the broader labor movement. It also fueled the perception that the Teamsters, under his leadership, had become a rogue operation, accountable to no one but Hoffa himself. Despite these challenges, Hoffa's grip on the Teamsters tightened. His followers revered him with near-religious devotion. They admired his toughness, his fearlessness, and his refusal to bow to pressure. To them, Hoffa was not just a union leader, he was a symbol of dignity, a man who understood their struggles and fought tooth and nail for their livelihoods. This loyalty was Hoffa's greatest weapon, one that allowed him to weather storms that would have destroyed lesser men. Yet the very qualities that made Hoffa so effective, his toughness, his pragmatism, his willingness to blur moral lines, also set him on a collision course with destiny. His use of the pension fund, his partnerships with the mob, and his defiance of the government created a web that grew ever more tangled. The deeper he wove himself into that web, the harder it became to imagine a way out. By the early 1960s, Hoffa stood at the height of his power. He was president of the largest labor union in the nation, master of billions in pension funds, and a man whose name evoked both admiration and fear. Yet all around him, forces gathered, government investigators determined to bring him down, rival unions eager to replace him, mob bosses who expected their interests to be protected, and even allies who might one day betray him. Hoffa was a king sitting on a precarious throne, surrounded by both loyal subjects and lurking enemies. For now, he projected strength, walking into union halls with his head held high, smiling as flashbulbs captured his every move, and daring the Kennedys to try and topple him. But even a man as formidable as Hoffa could not escape the reality that every empire has its challengers, and every rise carries within it the seeds of downfall. By the early 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa's empire was at its peak, but so too was the pressure mounting against him. He had achieved what few labor leaders in American history could boast: near absolute control of the nation's largest union, influence that stretched into politics and industry, and financial power through the Teamsters pension fund that rivaled major banks. Yet with that power came a relentless barrage of legal challenges. The Justice Department, under Robert F. Kennedy's leadership, was determined to break Hoffa. What followed was a series of indictments, trials, and courtroom battles that would expose cracks in Hoffa's seemingly unshakable armor. The Justice Department's Get Hoffa squad had spent years gathering evidence. Their focus was not limited to Hoffa's dealings with the mob but also extended to his alleged use of intimidation, bribery, and manipulation of union funds. By 1962, the government had filed multiple charges against him, ranging from wiretapping and jury tampering to misappropriation of pension money. Each case represented a calculated attempt to pin Hoffa down where previous efforts had failed. The first major trial that gripped the nation was the 1962 case in Nashville, Tennessee, where Hoffa was accused of attempting to bribe a grand juror. The charge was serious. If proven, it would confirm the government's long-standing suspicions that Hoffa would stop at nothing to shield himself from prosecution. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists captured every glare and smirk, and the public waited eagerly for each day's revelations. Hoffa, however, entered the courtroom as he always did, confident, almost theatrical. He wore his trademark suits, exuding the air of a man in control. To his supporters, he appeared as a wrong champion, unfairly targeted by a government vendetta. To his enemies, he was a brazen manipulator who thought himself above the law. The proceedings dragged on, filled with dramatic testimony and sharp exchanges between attorneys. But in the end, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. The result was a mistrial. For Hoffa, it was another escape, another opportunity to declare himself vindicated. For Robert Kennedy and his team, it was a bitter setback, though one that only intensified their resolve. The mistrial in Nashville became a symbol of Hoffa's uncanny ability to evade legal traps. Time and again, he slipped through the government's fingers, earning him a reputation as untouchable. Yet each trial also chipped away at his resources, his energy, and his public image. While his rank-and-file members remained loyal, the broader public began to see him less as a champion of labor and more as a shadowy figure mired in corruption. The government did not relent. New charges soon followed. In 1963, Hoffa faced a wiretapping case, accused of illegally eavesdropping on union conversations. Again, the trial was highly publicized, drawing crowds and headlines. And again, Hoffa managed to avoid conviction. His legal team, skilled and aggressive, exploited weaknesses in the prosecution's case, while Hoffa himself used his charisma to charm jurors and paint the government as overreaching. But the most significant blow came in 1964, when Hoffa was finally convicted in two separate trials. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, he was found guilty of jury tampering, ironically, the very tactic he had been accused of using years earlier in Nashville. Prosecutors presented evidence that Hoffa had attempted to bribe jurors in a previous case, and this time, the jury believed them. The conviction was a crushing moment. Hoffa, who had so often stood triumphant in the face of legal attacks, now faced the reality of prison. The same year, in Chicago, another trial brought further disaster. Hoffa was convicted of misusing the Teamsters pension fund, channeling millions of dollars into loans that benefited mob-connected businesses. This was the case the government had long hoped for, a direct link between Hoffa, the Teamsters' finances, and organized crime interests. The evidence painted a damning picture: loans to Las Vegas casinos, to construction projects controlled by the mafia, to ventures that had little to do with protecting workers and everything to do with enriching Hoffa's allies. The double convictions in 1964 marked a turning point. Hoffa was sentenced to a total of 13 years in prison. Though he immediately launched appeals, his invincible aura had been punctured. The man who once seemed untouchable was now branded a convicted felon. To the government, it was a triumph; to Hoffa's enemies, it was the beginning of his downfall. And yet, true to form, Hoffa refused to retreat quietly. Even while appealing his convictions, he remained firmly in control of the Teamsters. From his office in Washington, D.C., and his headquarters in Detroit, he continued to run the union with his characteristic toughness. He held meetings, issued directives, and maintained the loyalty of his lieutenants. His determination was astonishing. Most men facing prison might have withdrawn, but Hoffa clung to power with white-knuckled intensity. His defiance was not without cost. The convictions deepened divisions within the labor movement. Rival factions within the Teamsters began maneuvering for power, sensing that Hoffa's grip might be slipping. The AFL-CIO, already estranged from the Teamsters, used the convictions as proof of Hoffa's corruption. And within the mob itself, questions arose about whether Hoffa was still the best ally to protect their interests. The press, meanwhile, feasted on the drama. Headlines about Hoffa's trials filled newspapers. His face became a fixture on television screens. He was portrayed alternately as a villain brought to justice and as a folk hero persecuted by the Kennedys. The dichotomy only fueled his myth. Even as he stumbled, Hoffa remained larger than life. By the mid-1960s, the cracks in Hoffa's empire were clear. He had been convicted, sentenced, and humiliated in court. Yet he still held the presidency of the Teamsters, still commanded loyalty from millions of workers, and still believed he could outlast his enemies. "I'll go to prison before I ever quit," he once declared, and he meant it. What the government could not fully grasp was the depth of Hoffa's connection to his men. Even as he fought appeals and stared down the possibility of years behind bars, truckers and dockworkers continued to see him as their champion. To them, the convictions were proof not of his guilt but of the government's obsession. And Hoffa, ever the fighter, leaned into that narrative. He was not falling, he told them, he was standing firm, and when the day came, he would return stronger than ever. For now, though, the tide was shifting. The courtroom victories that had once defined Hoffa's career had turned into defeats. The legal walls that had seemed to close in slowly were now pressing hard against him. The man who had stared down senators and walked out of trials unscathed was about to face the one reality he could not charm, intimidate, or outmaneuver: life behind bars. By 1967, Jimmy Hoffa's world had shifted dramatically. The indomitable union boss who once held court in smoky hotel conference rooms and dictated terms to America's industries now faced an entirely different reality: federal prison. Hoffa began serving his sentence after exhausting appeals, and though he entered behind walls and barbed wire, he carried with him the same fierce determination that had marked his rise in the labor movement. For Hoffa, prison was not an end, it was simply another battlefield. From the moment he arrived, Hoffa's presence in the penitentiary was impossible to ignore. He was not just another inmate, he was Jimmy Hoffa, the man whose name was splashed across newspapers, the notorious Teamsters leader who had sparred with the Kennedys and run the most powerful union in the country. Guards and prisoners alike knew who he was. Some greeted him with awe, others with suspicion. But Hoffa himself walked into prison as though it were another negotiation table. He held his head high, his posture rigid, projecting the same authority that had served him on the outside. Prison life, however, was a sharp contrast to the luxury and influence Hoffa had grown accustomed to. Gone were the tailored suits, the private cars, the constant entourage. Instead, he was issued standard prison clothing and subjected to the same rules as everyone else. Meals were meager, routines were strict, and privacy was non-existent. Yet Hoffa adapted quickly. His background, growing up in poverty, working menial jobs, enduring hardship, had forged a resilience that served him well in confinement. He knew how to survive tough conditions. Still, Hoffa never accepted prison as permanent. From the start, he sought ways to maintain his authority and remain connected to the Teamsters outside the walls. Letters, visits, and coded messages became his lifeline. He appointed trusted lieutenants to act on his behalf, ensuring that his influence over the union continued even as he served his sentence. Prison officials tried to limit his communication, but Hoffa was resourceful. Through intermediaries, he continued to direct strategy, approve decisions, and remind his followers that he was still their leader. Among fellow inmates, Hoffa established himself as a figure of authority. Many prisoners, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, admired him. They respected his toughness, his refusal to bend, and his reputation for standing up to powerful enemies. Hoffa became something of a counselor in prison, listening to grievances, offering advice, and at times even mediating disputes. His natural ability to command respect carried over into the prison yard, where he built alliances and minimized conflicts. Yet the prison years also weighed heavily on him. For a man who thrived on movement, power, and constant action, confinement was suffocating. Hoffa filled his time with reading, correspondence, and exercise, but beneath the routines was a restless energy. He longed for the day he could walk free and reclaim his place at the helm of the Teamsters. He spoke often of his plans, telling anyone who would listen that he intended to run the union again once released. Prison, he declared, would not break him. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. The Teamsters, under new leadership, were moving in directions Hoffa did not always approve of. Frank Fitzsimmons, his former ally and chosen deputy, had stepped into the role of acting president. At first, Hoffa trusted him to hold the seat until his release. But over time, it became clear that Fitzsimmons had his own ambitions. He was less combative than Hoffa, more willing to cooperate with politicians and even with the government that Hoffa had fought so fiercely. To many, Fitzsimmons represented a softer, more diplomatic style of leadership. To Hoffa, it felt like betrayal. This realization burned within Hoffa during his prison years. He would read reports of Fitzsimmons attending White House events, shaking hands with leaders, and building relationships Hoffa himself had once dominated. Worse still, Fitzsimmons began consolidating his own power within the Union, cultivating loyalty and distancing himself from Hoffa's influence. From prison, Hoffa raged. Letters sent to allies conveyed his determination. When he got out, he would take back the presidency of the Teamsters, no matter the cost. The mob, too, watched Hoffa's imprisonment closely. For decades, Hoffa had been their crucial ally, granting access to the Teamsters' pension fund and ensuring union cooperation with mob-controlled businesses. But prison changed the equation. Fitzsimmons, though less fiery than Hoffa, proved to be more pliable and less troublesome for organized crime interests. To some mob leaders, Fitzsimmons was preferable. He delivered the benefits of the Teamsters without Hoffa's constant battles with the government. This shift only deepened Hoffa's frustration. He understood the mob's calculations. He knew they valued power and profit above loyalty. And he realized that when the time came for his release, he might face resistance not only from Fitzsimmons but also from underworld figures who feared his return would disrupt the convenient arrangement they now enjoyed. Inside prison, Hoffa kept these thoughts close to his chest, but his resolve hardened. He told confidants that upon his release, he would not just return, he would come back stronger, reclaim his throne, and remind everyone that he was still the true leader of the Teamsters. His vision was clear. Fitzsimmons was a caretaker, the mob was opportunistic, and only Hoffa could restore the Union to its rightful state. Yet the reality of prison life was humbling. Hoffa, once accustomed to wielding immense influence, was reduced to daily routines, roll calls, work assignments, nights in a small cell. At times, he grew impatient and angry, clashing with prison officials. But even in these moments, he maintained his identity. He was never simply inmate Hoffa, he was Jimmy Hoffa, and he made sure everyone knew it. His family, meanwhile, remained a source of strength. Visits from his wife Josephine and his children offered emotional support, though they also reminded him of the years slipping away. Hoffa missed milestones, family gatherings, and the ordinary comforts of home. He spoke often of how he wanted to make up for lost time once he was free. By the early 1970s, Hoffa's sentence was still ongoing, but the possibility of release loomed larger. Discussions of commutation and parole surfaced, raising both hope and tension. His enemies worried about his return, while his supporters waited eagerly for the day their leader would walk free. Hoffa himself focused on strategy. He was already planning his comeback, envisioning rallies, speeches, and the dramatic announcement of his candidacy to lead the Teamsters once more. Prison had stripped him of freedom, but it had not tamed his spirit. If anything, the years behind bars intensified his hunger for power and his determination to prove that Jimmy Hoffa could not be erased. The stage was being set for a dramatic return, but whether that return would be welcomed, or resisted, was a question that haunted both Hoffa and those who once stood at his side. The countdown to freedom was underway, and with it came a storm of anticipation. Hoffa believed he was destined to reclaim his empire, but outside the walls, forces were aligning that would make his path far more treacherous than he could have imagined. When Jimmy Hoffa finally stepped out of prison in 1971, the air around him was thick with anticipation. The man who had once dominated headlines and union halls emerged older, grayer, but unbowed. To his loyalists, this was the long-awaited return of their champion. To his enemies, both in government and in the underworld, his release was a problem, a disruption to the balance of power that had settled in his absence. Hoffa's return was not quiet, it was the beginning of a new, volatile chapter, marked by ambition, betrayal, and mounting danger. Hoffa's release was not the result of time served alone. President Richard Nixon had commuted his sentence, reducing the 13 years to less than 5 behind bars. The decision raised eyebrows across the nation. Critics whispered about backroom deals and questioned why Hoffa, of all people, had been granted such a favor. Rumors swirled about campaign contributions from Teamster coffers, about shady promises made in exchange for clemency. For Hoffa, however, the details mattered less than the outcome. He was free, and he believed destiny was calling him back to the throne. Freedom, however, was not without strings. Nixon's commutation carried a condition: Hoffa was barred from engaging in union activity until 1980. To most men, this restriction would have seemed insurmountable. For Hoffa, it was an insult, and a challenge. He had spent years in a cell imagining his triumphant return, plotting strategies, and convincing himself that he alone could lead the Teamsters. To be told he could not participate was, in his mind, an attempt to sideline him permanently. Hoffa's response was immediate and defiant. He had no intention of honoring the condition. "Nobody can tell me I can't run my union," he told Confidants. The union he returned to, however, was not the same one he had left. Frank Fitzsimmons, his former deputy, now held the presidency with a firm grip. In Hoffa's absence, Fitzsimmons had cultivated his own power base, drawing support from local leaders and enjoying close relationships with politicians and businessmen. To many, Fitzsimmons represented stability. He was less combative than Hoffa, more willing to compromise, and, crucially, he had kept the Teamsters' connections with organized crime running smoothly. Hoffa viewed Fitzsimmons with growing fury. To him, Fitzsimmons was no leader, he was a placeholder, a man meant to keep the chair warm until Hoffa returned. Instead, Fitzsimmons had used those years to carve out his own identity, one that did not include Jimmy Hoffa. The betrayal cut deep. From the moment he walked free, Hoffa began maneuvering to reclaim the presidency. He reached out to loyalists across the country, promising a revival of the old, hard-nosed leadership. He spoke at gatherings, gave interviews, and let it be known that he intended to run again. But Hoffa's ambitions collided with another obstacle: the mob. For decades, organized crime had enjoyed unparalleled access to the Teamsters' pension fund under Hoffa's watch. The millions funneled into casinos, construction projects, and business ventures had enriched mob families across the country. When Hoffa went to prison, many feared the gravy train would stop. But Fitzsimmons proved pliable. He maintained the flow of funds, often with less resistance than Hoffa had shown. For mob bosses, Fitzsimmons was ideal, a cooperative leader without Hoffa's stubborn streak. Hoffa's talk of returning to power alarmed them. They knew his style: confrontational, demanding, unwilling to be controlled. A Hoffa comeback threatened the comfortable arrangements they had built with Fitzsimmons. And so, even as Hoffa rallied his supporters, mob leaders whispered against him, warning him to step aside, to enjoy his freedom quietly and let Fitzsimmons continue. But Hoffa was not a man to be silenced. He believed the Teamsters were his, that he had built the union into a powerhouse, and that no one, not Fitzsimmons, not the mob, not even the President of the United States, could take that legacy from him. His campaign for a comeback began quietly but grew steadily louder. Hoffa traveled to Union strongholds, meeting with rank-and-file members who remembered his fierce defense of their rights. To them, Fitzsimmons seemed distant, more aligned with Washington than with the workers on the ground. Hoffa reminded them of his victories, higher wages, better benefits, and the pride of being part of the most powerful union in the nation. He painted his return as not just a personal ambition but as a necessity for the working man. At the same time, Hoffa worked behind the scenes, gathering allies within local unions and plotting a strategy to challenge Fitzsimmons at the ballot box. He knew it would be a fight, but he also knew that his name carried weight. Hoffa was not just a leader, he was a legend. He believed that legend alone could carry him back into power. Yet cracks were visible. The government, still wary of Hoffa, monitored his every move. Federal investigators tracked his meetings, recorded his calls, and prepared for the possibility that Hoffa's return would once again entangle the Union in corruption and violence. Within the mob, discussions grew darker. Hoffa's persistence was becoming a problem, one that could not be ignored indefinitely. Despite the obstacles, Hoffa pressed on. His speeches became sharper, his criticism of Fitzsimmons more direct. He accused his successor of weakness, of selling out the Union's values. He mocked his willingness to bow to politicians and mob bosses. Hoffa framed himself as the true defender of the workers, the man who had never backed down, who had gone to prison rather than abandon his post. By 1973 and 1974, Hoffa's push for a comeback was no longer speculation, it was reality. He filed lawsuits challenging the restrictions on his participation, sought legal pathways to overturn Nixon's conditions, and prepared openly for a campaign to retake the presidency. Each move heightened the tension. Fitzsimmons maneuvered to protect his position, while mob bosses quietly debated how to handle the man who refused to stay retired. Hoffa himself seemed blind to the danger. Or perhaps he saw it and ignored it, convinced that his force of will could overcome even the most powerful enemies. He told friends that nothing and no one could stop him. To step aside, in his view, was to betray his life's work. To retire quietly would be to admit defeat, and Hoffa was not a man who admitted defeat. But behind the scenes, the storm was building. Every handshake, every speech, every rally brought Hoffa closer to confrontation, with Fitzsimmons, with the mob, and with fate itself. The lines were drawn, Hoffa wanted his union back, and powerful men wanted him gone. What happened next would not only shape his future but also seal his place in history. The stage was set for a collision, one that would pit Hoffa's stubborn ambition against forces far larger, far more dangerous, than he had ever faced before. The countdown to his disappearance had begun, though Hoffa, ever confident, still believed he was untouchable. By 1973, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer content with whispers of a comeback, he was openly waging war for the Teamsters' throne. His release from prison had reignited his old fire, and every fiber of his being was bent toward reclaiming the power that he believed was rightfully his. But this campaign, more than any battle he had fought before, carried with it a shadow of danger. It was no longer just about Union politics or federal investigations. It was about survival, as Hoffa's determination placed him squarely at odds with two powerful forces, Frank Fitzsimmons, the man who had taken his seat, and the mob bosses who preferred the status quo. Hoffa's campaign began with speeches to small groups of truckers, dockworkers, and union locals. He reminded them of the glory days, how he had fought tooth and nail to win higher wages, safer working conditions, and unparalleled benefits. He spoke of strikes that had crippled industries and negotiations where he had stared down CEOs without blinking. His message was clear, the Teamsters were strong under him, and they had grown complacent under Fitzsimmons. He painted his rival as a weak, cozy insider who had sold out the workers in exchange for Washington handshakes and mob favor. The word struck a chord. Among the rank-and-file members, Hoffa's name still carried a kind of mythic weight. For many, he wasn't just a Union president, he was a symbol of defiance, a man who had gone to prison rather than bow to authority. When Hoffa spoke, men nodded along, some with clenched fists, as though transported back to the years when the Union was feared nationwide. His rallies grew in size and energy, and murmurs began to spread, perhaps Hoffa really could come back. But his efforts were not limited to public speeches. Behind the scenes, Hoffa launched a full-scale political operation. He called in favors from old allies, reached out to local union bosses, and promised a revival of the iron-fisted but effective leadership style that had made the Teamsters such a powerhouse. Meetings took place in dimly lit union halls, in back rooms of bars, and in the kitchens of loyal supporters' homes. Hoffa was building a coalition, brick by brick, and he intended to use it to unseat Fitzsimmons at the next convention. The problem was that Hoffa was not the only one playing the game. Fitzsimmons had been underestimated before, but now he had firmly entrenched himself as the legitimate president. He had control of the Teamsters' treasury, influence over local leaders, and perhaps most importantly, the backing of organized crime families who saw him as a reliable partner. Fitzsimmons might not have had Hoffa's charisma or toughness, but he had something just as valuable: stability. And the mob liked stability. For the mafia, Hoffa's comeback bid was a threat. Under Fitzsimmons, the pension fund, worth billions, continued to flow into mob-controlled projects. Casinos in Las Vegas were being built with Teamster money, construction ventures were funded, and mob bosses reaped enormous profits. Hoffa, with his fiery personality and stubborn streak, was seen as a wild card. He had always been willing to do business with the mob, but he also insisted on being the one in charge. To mob bosses who preferred a more compliant leader, Hoffa's return threatened to upset a highly profitable balance. As Hoffa's campaign gathered momentum, warnings began to surface. Some of his closest allies quietly told him to back off, to let Fitzsimmons stay in place, and to enjoy his freedom. The mob's message was simple: the Teamsters were running smoothly, and Hoffa had served his time. Why not step aside, take a pension, and live out his years in comfort? But Hoffa dismissed these warnings with disdain. To him, retiring quietly was unthinkable. "They can't keep me out," he said more than once. "This is my union." Hoffa's defiance only heightened the tension. FBI surveillance reports from the time noted his frequent meetings with union men and his not-so-subtle attempts to rally support against Fitzsimmons. Agents trailed him to hotels, restaurants, and union offices, recording every movement. They understood what Hoffa seemed unwilling to admit, that his comeback bid was not just a labor dispute, it was a flashpoint in a much larger struggle involving organized crime, politics, and the federal government. The media, too, seized on the story. Newspapers ran headlines about Hoffa's comeback, often portraying him as a stubborn relic of a bygone era. Some journalists admired his tenacity, while others mocked his inability to let go of the past. But regardless of the tone, one fact was clear: Hoffa's name was back in the spotlight, and his battle for the Teamsters was front-page news. By 1974, Hoffa's campaign had reached a fever pitch. He filed lawsuits to challenge Nixon's restrictions on his union activity, arguing that the conditions placed on his release were unconstitutional. Legal battles played out in courtrooms as Hoffa sought a path to re-enter the union officially. He also increased his public appearances, speaking with renewed urgency, telling workers that the soul of the Teamsters was at stake. Behind closed doors, however, conversations about Hoffa took a darker turn. Mob bosses, including some of the most powerful names in the country, were reportedly growing restless. Hoffa's insistence on returning, despite repeated warnings, made him a liability. His refusal to accept the new order threatened not just Fitzsimmons' presidency but also the vast web of financial interests tied to the pension fund. If Hoffa regained control, he could disrupt deals worth millions. For men who had killed for far less, this was not acceptable. Still, Hoffa pressed on. His stubbornness was legendary, and he believed that sheer willpower could carry him through. To him, the mob's disapproval was irrelevant. He had worked with them for decades, and he knew their methods. He thought he could outmaneuver them, just as he had outmaneuvered the government and his rivals in the past. Hoffa underestimated just how deep their opposition ran. Even within his own family, there were concerns. His wife, Josephine, urged him to slow down, to consider the risks. Friends pleaded with him to let go of the dream. But Hoffa was unmoved. He told them all the same thing: the Union was his life, his identity, and his legacy. Without it, he was nothing. He would not be remembered as a man who gave up. By mid-decade, the conflict had reached a breaking point. Fitzsimmons was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to hold on to power. The mob was quietly but firmly closing ranks against Hoffa. And Hoffa, alone against them both, grew ever more vocal, ever more determined. His speeches carried a sharp edge, filled with warnings and promises. He spoke as though nothing, not politics, not prison, not even the mafia, could stop him. But forces beyond his control were aligning. Behind the scenes, decisions were being made, conversations held in quiet corners of restaurants and in smoky backrooms. Powerful men were asking a dangerous question: if Hoffa refused to step aside, how long could he be allowed to remain a threat? The comeback campaign, in Hoffa's eyes, was a fight for redemption. In reality, it was a march toward the most dangerous confrontation of his life, a confrontation that would ultimately seal his fate. By 1975, Jimmy Hoffa's war to reclaim his old empire had reached its most volatile stage. He had fought battles against politicians, prosecutors, and rivals before, but this fight was different. This was a collision not only with Frank Fitzsimmons, who was determined to remain president of the Teamsters, but also with the mob bosses who had grown fat off the union's wealth in Hoffa's absence. What Hoffa refused to accept, or perhaps stubbornly believed he could overcome, was the reality that his very existence had become a liability to men who wielded power in shadows, men who did not hesitate to eliminate problems with a single, decisive act. The mafia had once been Hoffa's greatest ally. They had backed him during his rise, greased the wheels of his influence, and reaped enormous profits through their access to the Teamsters pension fund. Las Vegas casinos, construction projects, trucking companies, and even real estate developments across the country had been bankrolled with Teamster money, funneled through mob-friendly loans. But under Fitzsimmons' pliable leadership, the mob no longer had to contend with Hoffa's fiery independence or his obsession with control. Fitzsimmons was reliable. He let them do business without interference, and he never questioned their share. For the mafia, it was the perfect arrangement. Hoffa threatened all of that. His return would mean more than just a change in leadership, it would mean a renegotiation of power. Hoffa had never been afraid to strike deals with mob bosses, but he insisted on being the man at the head of the table. In 1975, that made him a dangerous man. His efforts to re-establish control over the pension fund, billions of dollars in union money, were perceived as a direct challenge to the mob's dominance. For them, Hoffa wasn't just stubborn, he was reckless. The signs of danger were everywhere. Mob-connected figures sent word, some subtly, others bluntly, urging Hoffa to abandon his comeback campaign. One of the clearest voices came from Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano, a powerful New Jersey Teamsters leader with deep ties to the mafia. Once an ally of Hoffa, Tony Pro had grown into a formidable rival, and their relationship had soured into outright hostility. The two men clashed repeatedly, both in private and in public, over union control. At one point, Hoffa accused Tony Pro of betrayal, while Tony Pro mocked Hoffa as a relic, a man who didn't understand that the world had changed while he was behind bars. Their animosity became so personal that Hoffa reportedly declared he would never share power with Tony Pro again. But Tony Pro was not a man to be dismissed lightly. His reputation for violence was well earned, and his influence stretched deep into the mob underworld. Their feud, bitter and public, became symbolic of Hoffa's larger war. He was trying to reclaim an empire in a world that had already moved on. Every insult, every act of defiance, deepened the mob's conviction that Hoffa could not be controlled, and therefore, could not be tolerated. Despite the rising tension, Hoffa pressed forward. His defiance bordered on reckless bravado. He continued to meet with union leaders across the country, rallying support for a comeback. He filed lawsuits challenging the restrictions on his release from prison, arguing that Richard Nixon's conditions were unconstitutional. He courted the press, granting interviews where he made no attempt to hide his disdain for Fitzsimmons or the mob interests backing him. In Hoffa's mind, this was his union, and no one, not the President of the United States, not the mafia, not even his old allies, could take that from him. The FBI, meanwhile, was watching closely. Agents had long considered Hoffa a man worth monitoring, but in 1975 their interest deepened. Surveillance reports documented his meetings with mob-connected figures, his speeches to union locals, and his movements across cities. To the FBI, Hoffa's attempt to claw his way back into power looked less like a labor campaign and more like the ignition point for a war between factions of organized crime. Some agents believed that Hoffa's stubbornness would get him killed, others suspected he was already marked for elimination. Even Hoffa's friends and family began to sense the danger. His wife, Josephine, pleaded with him to slow down, to enjoy his freedom. His children worried about the tone of threats whispered in their father's orbit. Loyalists begged him to consider compromise. But Hoffa was unmoved. He insisted that walking away from the Teamsters would mean walking away from everything he had built, everything that defined him. Without the Union, he was just another man. With it, he was immortal. The summer of 1975 became a critical turning point. Hoffa's efforts to consolidate his comeback had reached a point of no return. He scheduled meetings with mob-connected leaders, hoping to broker understandings that would allow him to regain control without sparking outright war. But these meetings often turned tense, even hostile. Accounts from those close to Hoffa suggest that he underestimated how much power he had lost during his years behind bars. He still saw himself as the kingmaker, the man who could dictate terms. But to the mafia, Hoffa was now a problem to be solved. Behind closed doors, mob bosses deliberated. Conversations reportedly took place among figures from Detroit, New Jersey, and even Chicago. The consensus was forming: Hoffa would not step aside, and as long as he remained alive and active, he would be a threat to their interests. His feud with Tony Pro was only part of the equation. The larger issue was his refusal to accept the new balance of power. Where Fitzsimmons was cooperative, Hoffa was combative. Where Fitzsimmons allowed them free rein, Hoffa would demand control. It became increasingly clear to the mob that Hoffa's comeback could not be allowed to succeed. Still, Hoffa refused to see the storm gathering around him. His confidence bordered on arrogance. He told friends that the mob wouldn't dare touch him, that he was too important, too visible, too connected. He had survived government investigations, Senate hearings, and prison. Why would the mafia be any different? Hoffa believed that his legacy and his network of allies would protect him. In reality, his isolation was growing, and the men plotting his fate had already moved beyond warnings. In July 1975, Hoffa began telling friends and family about an upcoming meeting he had scheduled with Tony Pro and other mob-connected leaders in Detroit. The purpose, he claimed, was to settle differences and chart a path forward for the Union. But to those who knew the depth of his feud with Tony Pro, the meeting sounded like a dangerous gamble. Some urged him not to go. Others reminded him of the threats that had been circulating for months. But Hoffa, ever the fighter, insisted that he could handle it. He believed he could walk into a room with his enemies and walk out victorious. What Hoffa did not realize was that his enemies had already decided otherwise. The very meeting he anticipated as a chance to resolve conflicts may well have been orchestrated as a trap. And for the first time in his life, Hoffa was about to find himself in a battle where his legendary toughness and stubbornness could not save him. As July 30, 1975 approached, the air around Hoffa grew heavy with foreboding. Friends recalled that he seemed both determined and restless, as if sensing that he was nearing the climax of his struggle. But true to form, he pressed on. Hoffa was a man who had built his life on defiance, and he would not change course now. To the end, he believed he could reclaim his union. What he didn't know was that his war had already been decided, not by ballots or rallies, but in the whispered conversations of men who dealt in shadows and silence. July 30, 1975, began like so many summer days in Detroit, humid, heavy, the air thick with the kind of warmth that clings to the skin. For Jimmy Hoffa, it was supposed to be just another day of business, another attempt to wrestle back control of the Teamsters through meetings and negotiations. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of the morning lay currents of unease, whispers of danger, and a fate that would turn this day into one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Hoffa left his modest home in Lake Orion, Michigan, that morning with determination written on his face. He told his wife, Josephine, that he had a meeting scheduled at 2 p.m. at the Machu's Red Fox, a suburban Detroit restaurant in Bloomfield Township. The meeting, he explained, was with Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, two men whose names carried both weight and menace in the world of organized crime. The purpose, Hoffa said, was to settle things once and for all. For Hoffa, this meeting represented both risk and opportunity. Tony Pro was his bitter rival, a man he had clashed with violently in the past. Tony Jack, on the other hand, was a Detroit mobster known for his influence and his role as a mediator. Hoffa believed that with the right words, the right show of strength, he could strike a deal that would pave the way for his return to the Teamsters' throne. What he could not know, or refuse to accept, was that the very men he planned to meet may have been planning something entirely different. As the morning unfolded, Hoffa made phone calls to confirm the meeting. At 1:45 p.m., he phoned his wife, telling her he was at the Machu's Red Fox but that no one else had arrived yet. He sounded impatient, even irritated. To Josephine, the call was brief and ordinary, but in hindsight, it became one of the last direct communications anyone would ever have with Jimmy Hoffa. Outside the restaurant, Hoffa waited. Witnesses later recalled seeing him pacing near his car, a maroon Pontiac Grandville. He checked his watch repeatedly, his expression a mix of annoyance and determination. Hoffa was a man who valued punctuality, and he considered lateness a sign of disrespect. To be kept waiting by men he already distrusted only fueled his frustration. Around this time, Hoffa also placed a call to his friend Louis Linteau, a trusted associate. "Where the hell are they?" Hoffa asked, referring to Tony Pro and Tony Jack. "I've been here since 2 o'clock. Linteau recalled that Hoffa's tone was sharp, his patience wearing thin. He told Hoffa to sit tight, to give it time, but the conversation only underscored Hoffa's growing agitation. What happened next has been pieced together only through fragments of witness statements, circumstantial evidence, and decades of speculation. Sometime after 2:30 p.m., Hoffa was seen standing outside his car, still waiting. Then, as several accounts suggest, a car pulled up. Some witnesses claimed it was a Mercury Marquis, others insisted it was a different make. What seems consistent is that Hoffa approached the vehicle, exchanged a few words, and then got inside. From that moment forward, Jimmy Hoffa was never seen again. Hours passed, and when Hoffa did not return home, his family grew concerned. By evening, his children began calling around, asking friends and associates if anyone had seen him. By nightfall, Josephine reported him missing to the police. At first, law enforcement treated it as a routine disappearance. Perhaps Hoffa had gotten caught up in business or was visiting a friend. But those who knew Hoffa best understood instantly, something was wrong. Hoffa was not the kind of man to vanish quietly. The FBI quickly became involved, recognizing the gravity of the situation. Agents descended upon the Machu's Red Fox parking lot, examining Hoffa's car, which was still parked neatly where he had left it. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. It was as if Hoffa had simply stepped out of existence. Speculation ran rampant. Had Tony Pro and Tony Jack orchestrated the meeting as a setup? Or had Hoffa been lured away under false pretenses, believing he was heading to negotiate, only to find himself in a car with men who had no intention of talking. Witnesses recalled seeing a maroon car, others mentioned a green one, but no clear consensus emerged. Even the timeline remained murky, clouded by conflicting reports and fading memories. By the next day, the story exploded across national headlines. "Where is Jimmy Hoffa?" newspapers asked, their bold type capturing the sense of shock that gripped the country. For decades, Hoffa had been a figure who loomed large in American life, labor hero to some, criminal conspirator to others. His disappearance was both scandalous and surreal. How could a man of such stature, so well known and constantly monitored, simply vanish in broad daylight from a public parking lot? Theories multiplied almost instantly. Some believed the mafia had orchestrated the disappearance to silence Hoffa once and for all, ensuring he could never reclaim power. Others speculated that Hoffa had staged his own disappearance, retreating into hiding to escape his enemies. A few suggested government involvement, pointing to Hoffa's history of clashes with federal authorities. In the weeks that followed, the search intensified. Helicopters scoured forests near Detroit, divers plunged into lakes and rivers, dogs sniffed through abandoned buildings. Every lead seemed promising, every rumor worth chasing. Yet time after time, investigators came up empty-handed. The trail grew colder with each passing day, and with it, the sense of mystery deepened. For Hoffa's family, the disappearance was a nightmare without end. His wife clung to hope, praying he would walk through the door, alive and unharmed. His children wrestled with grief and uncertainty, haunted by the absence of answers. Friends and allies whispered in hushed tones, careful not to say too much, fearful of the same fate. The day of Hoffa's disappearance marked the beginning of a legend. In that parking lot outside the Machu's Red Fox, the line between history and myth blurred forever. The image of Hoffa standing beside his car, waiting for men who would never arrive, became frozen in time, an unfinished story, a question without an answer. And as the hours turned into days, one truth became clear: Jimmy Hoffa had vanished into the shadows, and the world would never be the same. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa on July 30, 1975, did not simply make headlines, it ignited a frenzy. Within 24 hours, what began as a missing persons report had transformed into one of the most high-profile investigations in American history. This was not just any man who had gone missing. This was the former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a labor icon, a power broker, and a figure whose life was interwoven with both politics and organized crime. The stakes could not have been higher. The first wave of investigation began at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant parking lot, where Hoffa's maroon Pontiac Grandville still sat, untouched. FBI agents and local police examined it carefully, hoping for clues. Yet the car offered little in the way of answers. There was no blood, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing to suggest a violent confrontation had taken place. The car looked as though Hoffa had parked it, stepped out for a quick meeting, and intended to return. But he never did. Witnesses were questioned almost immediately. Several claimed they saw Hoffa pacing near his car that afternoon, glancing at his watch, appearing frustrated. A few recalled seeing him talking to men in a car that pulled up nearby, but the details varied. Some said the car was a Mercury Marquis, others a green Pontiac, while still others could not recall the make or model. The accounts overlapped but never aligned perfectly, leaving investigators with a hazy, unreliable picture of what had transpired. By the second day, the FBI had declared Hoffa's disappearance a matter of federal concern. Agents swarmed Detroit, following every possible lead. Hoffa was too significant, too notorious, for his vanishing act to be treated lightly. The Bureau suspected organized crime almost immediately. After all, Hoffa's ongoing feud with Anthony "Tony Provenzano was no secret. Nor was his determination to reclaim leadership of the Teamsters, which put him directly at odds with mafia interests that profited immensely from Frank Fitzsimmons' pliable presidency. Investigators moved quickly to interview those closest to the meeting Hoffa claimed he was attending that afternoon. Tony Pro, when questioned, flatly denied he had any meeting scheduled with Hoffa that day. He claimed he was in New Jersey at the time, backed by an alibi that was difficult to shake. Tony Giacalone, the Detroit mobster Hoffa also named, insisted he too had no such meeting and produced his own explanations for his whereabouts. Both men, seasoned veterans of law enforcement scrutiny, stuck to their denials with icy precision. For the FBI, the problem was immediate and frustrating: they had no body, no crime scene, and no witnesses willing to cooperate. Organized crime operated in a code of silence, omerta, and Hoffa's disappearance was the kind of matter no one would dare speak about openly. To break that silence required either luck or betrayal, and the Bureau had neither in those crucial early days. Still, the search pressed forward. Helicopters hovered over Michigan forests. Divers explored the murky waters of lakes and rivers near Detroit. Dogs were deployed to sniff through abandoned warehouses and fields. Agents searched basements, garages, and even farms suspected of mafia ties. Every possible location became a potential burial site. Yet despite the manpower and resources, no evidence emerged. Hoffa had vanished as though swallowed by the earth. The FBI began tracing Hoffa's last phone calls, desperate for clarity. His final call to Louis Linteau confirmed he had been at the Machu's Red Fox, waiting impatiently. But beyond that, the trail went cold. Hoffa's movements after 2:30 p.m. were a blank slate, leaving agents to theorize what might have happened in those missing minutes. Meanwhile, the media circus grew. Television crews camped outside the Hoffa family home, broadcasting Josephine's anguish to a nation transfixed by the mystery. Reporters speculated endlessly: was Hoffa killed by the mafia? Did government forces silence him to prevent a comeback? Or had Hoffa, always a fighter, engineered his own disappearance as an elaborate scheme? Newspapers filled their pages with theories, each more dramatic than the last. Behind the scenes, investigators knew the most likely explanation. Hoffa had crossed the mob one time too many. His insistence on regaining power threatened billions of dollars in mafia-controlled pension investments. Men like Tony Pro, whose feud with Hoffa was bitter and personal, had both motive and opportunity. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. The mob left no evidence. If Hoffa had been killed, the disposal of his body was handled with ruthless efficiency. The FBI assembled a Hoffa squad, a dedicated task force focused solely on solving the disappearance. Agents interviewed hundreds of witnesses, subpoenaed union records, and tracked mob activity across state lines. Wiretaps were expanded, informants pressured. Yet time and again, the leads fizzled out. A tip would come in: Hoffa buried under a barn, Hoffa hidden in a warehouse, Hoffa dumped in a lake, but when investigators searched, they found nothing. For the Hoffa family, each day without answers was torture. Josephine struggled to keep her composure under the glare of cameras, clinging to hope even as the odds grew darker. Hoffa's children, too, wrestled with grief and the surreal reality that their father had simply vanished. Friends and allies whispered warnings: pressing too hard for answers could invite more danger. In Detroit's underworld, people had already decided to keep their mouths shut. Weeks stretched into months, and the absence of evidence became its own haunting mystery. How could a man as famous as Jimmy Hoffa disappear without a single trace? The FBI had broken open mafia cases before, but this time, they found themselves chasing shadows. The mob, for its part, acted as though Hoffa had never existed. No one slipped, no one boasted, no one betrayed the silence. By the end of 1975, the investigation had stalled. Agents continued to work leads, but without a body, prosecutors could not bring charges. Theories multiplied, but hard facts remained elusive. Hoffa's disappearance was no longer just a criminal investigation, it had become a legend, a riddle etched into the American consciousness. The cold efficiency of Hoffa's vanishing was what made it so chilling. Unlike other mob killings, where bodies were found or rumors circulated openly, Hoffa had been erased. Whoever planned the act had done so with meticulous care, ensuring that no trace remained. To this day, that vanishing act stands as one of the most perfect crimes in modern history. For the FBI, the frustration was palpable. They had surveillance, intelligence, and manpower, but they could not force answers from a wall of silence. Each passing week cemented the reality: Jimmy Hoffa had disappeared into the shadows of organized crime, and unless someone broke their vow of silence, the truth would remain hidden. What began as a routine meeting at a suburban restaurant had turned into a mystery that would baffle the nation for decades. Hoffa's empty car in the parking lot stood as a silent monument, a reminder that power, pride, and betrayal often end in silence. The investigation had begun, but already the trail was fading, leaving only questions that echoed louder with every passing day. When Jimmy Hoffa vanished in July 1975, the shock of his disappearance was matched only by the silence that followed. The FBI, the media, and the American public were left with a haunting absence: no body, no crime scene, no confession. Out of that void, speculation flourished. Hoffa's vanishing became not just a crime but a riddle, spawning theories that stretched across cities, industries, and even decades. Some theories were grounded in evidence, others in rumor, and still others in the realm of myth. Together, they formed a tapestry of mystery that ensured Hoffa's name would never fade from public imagination. The most immediate theory, and the one most widely accepted by investigators, was that Hoffa had been murdered by the mafia. His feud with Tony Provenzano provided a clear motive. Their relationship had disintegrated into open hostility, and Hoffa's ambition to reclaim the Teamsters posed a direct threat to mob interests. To the mafia, Hoffa's return would mean tighter control, less flexibility, and the possibility of exposure. Eliminating him was both practical and permanent. Yet the mafia, true to form, left nothing behind. No one slipped, no one bragged, no one confessed. Instead, investigators were left to chase whispers. Some said Hoffa had been lured into a car under the pretense of a peace meeting, only to be driven to his death. Others suggested he was killed quickly in Detroit and his body disposed of before nightfall. But how and where remained the central puzzle. One of the earliest rumors suggested that Hoffa's body had been stuffed into a 55-gallon steel drum and shipped off to New Jersey, buried beneath a landfill or a construction site. The theory made sense: it was efficient, untraceable, and typical of mob operations. Some informants even hinted that the drum was mixed into the foundation of a building, ensuring Hoffa's remains would never be recovered. For years, construction projects across New Jersey drew quiet suspicion, as if Hoffa might be entombed beneath office towers and warehouses. Another popular theory placed Hoffa beneath Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The idea, almost cinematic in its imagery, suggested that during construction of the stadium in the mid-1970s, Hoffa's body was smuggled into the site and buried under the end zone. The story caught fire in the press, blending the real underworld with the drama of American sports. Even though later FBI searches dismissed the claim, the legend persisted, living on as one of the most enduring myths in popular culture. Fans attending football games sometimes joked that Hoffa's ghost lingered beneath the turf, a reminder that his story had transcended fact into folklore. There were darker, more brutal theories as well. Some claimed Hoffa had been taken to a mob-controlled house near Detroit, strangled, and his body cremated in a nearby incinerator. The cremation theory appealed to investigators for its practicality. It explained why no trace of Hoffa was ever found. A fire hot enough could erase every piece of evidence. Years later, mobsters would whisper to journalists about crematoriums, rendering plants, and industrial furnaces. None of the stories were confirmed, but each seemed chillingly plausible. Others insisted that Hoffa's remains had been buried in rural Michigan, perhaps on a farm owned by mob associates. Over the years, specific farms were searched, sometimes with ground-penetrating radar, sometimes with dogs. Each time, the result was the same: nothing. But the image of Hoffa lying in an unmarked grave, hidden under farmland or woods, continued to fuel speculation. Theories also expanded into the realm of the fantastical. Some claimed Hoffa had been dropped into the Great Lakes, weighed down with chains. Others suggested his body had been fed into a steel mill's furnace, reduced to nothingness in the roar of molten metal. A few even speculated that Hoffa had staged his disappearance, fleeing to South America or Europe under a false identity. While most dismissed this as unlikely, the mystery's very nature invited such wild possibilities. For the FBI, sifting through these theories was both necessary and maddening. Each tip had to be investigated, each rumor tracked, no matter how improbable. Over the years, countless digs were conducted, fields plowed, barns torn apart, foundations drilled. In one case, the backyard of a Detroit home was excavated after a mobster claimed Hoffa had been buried there. Nothing was found. Each failure deepened the frustration, but also the legend. Hoffa's vanishing seemed to mock investigators, as though he had slipped permanently into the shadows. Part of what fueled the endless speculation was the nature of Hoffa himself. He was not an anonymous victim. He was a man whose life had been lived in the spotlight, whose every action had been watched, recorded, and debated. His disappearance was not just a personal tragedy but a national mystery, one that combined labor unions, organized crime, and politics into a single unsolved puzzle. Every theory carried with it the weight of history, because Hoffa was not just anyone, he was Hoffa. The mafia, of course, offered no help. If Hoffa had indeed been killed by mob orders, those involved carried the secret to their graves. Over time, a few mobsters and associates dropped hints. Some claimed to know the truth, others bragged of their role, but none provided evidence that could stand up in court. For the FBI, it was a bitter reality, they could circle the truth but never pin it down. Meanwhile, the public fascination grew. Books, documentaries, and articles kept the mystery alive, each offering a new angle or theory. The question, what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, became one of the most famous unsolved riddles in American culture. Even decades later, Hoffa's name could conjure a mix of intrigue, suspicion, and myth. As the years turned into decades, the rumors hardened into folklore. Theories about drums, stadiums, furnaces, and farms were repeated so often that they became part of the legend itself. Perhaps none were true, or perhaps one was. The beauty, and the tragedy, of Hoffa's disappearance was that no one could say for certain. He had been erased with such efficiency that the mystery itself became his legacy. For Hoffa's family, the endless speculation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the attention kept his memory alive, on the other, it meant reliving the uncertainty year after year. They had no closure, no grave to visit, no answers to their most basic questions. Each new theory dangled hope before them, only to be crushed when another search came up empty. The rumors, wild and endless, spoke to the power of the story. Hoffa's disappearance was not just about a man, it was about the collision of labor, crime, and power in America. It was about how one of the most famous figures of the 20th century could be silenced so completely that even the passage of time could not unravel the truth. And so, as the years passed, the theories only grew. Each generation added its own twists, its own imagined endings. Jimmy Hoffa, the man who had once been larger than life, had now become something even greater, an unsolved riddle, a story with no final chapter, a shadow that refused to fade. In the immediate aftermath of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the FBI mobilized in full force. For them, this was not just the case of a missing man, it was the vanishing of one of the most high-profile figures in the nation. Hoffa had been an icon, a labor titan, a convicted felon, and a man with deep ties to organized crime. His sudden absence demanded answers. Yet, despite the urgency, investigators quickly realized they were facing not an ordinary crime but a labyrinth designed by silence, fear, and loyalty to a code of secrecy that ran deeper than law. The FBI began by retracing Hoffa's last known steps on that July afternoon in 1975. The parking lot of the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township became a focal point, swarmed by agents, local police, and reporters. Hoffa's car was still there, locked and empty, as though mocking investigators with its quiet stillness. It was a scene that should have been ordinary, a car, a lot, a suburban restaurant, but it was instead transformed into a stage for one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Witnesses were questioned relentlessly. Some remembered seeing Hoffa pacing near his car, glancing at his watch. Others thought they saw him speaking to men inside another vehicle. But nothing was concrete, nothing that could hold under scrutiny. The minutes ticked away, and with them, any hope of finding Hoffa alive seemed to vanish. The first wave of suspects was obvious. Anthony "Tony" Provenzano, Hoffa's bitter rival, sat at the top of the list. Provenzano denied having met Hoffa that day and offered an alibi that investigators could not fully crack. Then there was Anthony Giacalone, the Detroit mobster who had supposedly helped arrange the meeting. Giacalone, too, denied involvement. Each suspect pointed elsewhere, and the circle of silence held firm. Searches began almost immediately. Woods, rivers, and fields around Detroit were combed. Dogs were brought in, helicopters scanned from above, and volunteers joined agents in looking for any trace. Nothing emerged. Every day that passed made the mystery colder. And yet, the FBI refused to give up. Over the months, tips began pouring in from across the country. Some were credible, others bizarre. A prison inmate claimed Hoffa had been buried in a marsh. A mob associate whispered that the body was incinerated in a crematorium. Another tip led to a suburban home where agents tore apart the floorboards, hoping to uncover a hidden grave. Time after time, the searches ended in failure. Hoffa remained nowhere and everywhere, a ghost slipping between shadows. The FBI's frustration grew, but the case became an obsession. Agents described it as a black hole that consumed resources, energy, and careers. Leads were pursued in Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and even Las Vegas. Informants were turned, wiretaps installed, and mobsters pressured. Still, the underworld held its silence. It was as if Hoffa had been erased by professionals who knew exactly how to make a body disappear forever. By the late 1970s, the FBI had compiled thousands of pages of files. The case was treated as a top priority, and yet every report seemed to circle back to the same conclusion: Hoffa was dead, but proving it was impossible. The mafia's discipline, its culture of omerta, the vow of silence, proved stronger than federal pressure. Men who might have known the truth preferred prison or death to betrayal. Meanwhile, Hoffa's family lived in limbo. His wife, Josephine, clung to hope in the early years, praying for answers, but as time stretched on, even hope grew heavy. Hoffa's children faced the agony of not knowing whether their father had died quickly or suffered, whether he had been buried respectfully or discarded like waste. For them, the absence of truth was its own torment. In 1982, after 7 years of chasing shadows, the government took a decisive step. A Michigan court declared Jimmy Hoffa legally dead. The ruling was practical, necessary for the settlement of his estate, the resolution of financial matters, and the closure of official records. But for the public, the declaration was both anticlimactic and haunting. Hoffa had gone from being a man of flesh and blood to a ghost bound in legal paperwork. He was, in the eyes of the law, no longer missing but gone forever. The FBI, however, did not stop. Even after the declaration of death, the case remained active. Agents described it as a living file, one that refused to close. Every few years, a new tip would surface, reigniting interest. Farms would be dug up. Warehouses inspected. Empty lots torn apart in the hope of finding what had eluded them for decades. Each time, cameras would swarm, the public would wait, and the result would be the same: nothing. The 1980s and 1990s brought waves of supposed confessions. Mobsters nearing the end of their lives sometimes hinted at involvement, offering tantalizing details but no evidence. Some named names, some gave locations, but none of it ever panned out. Each confession seemed designed less for truth than for attention, perhaps even revenge. The FBI followed them all, yet every trail ran cold. Despite the failures, the case retained its power. Journalists continued to write, historians continued to debate, and ordinary people continued to speculate. Hoffa's disappearance became less about finding a body and more about what it symbolized. It was proof of the mafia's reach, of the fragility of power, of the way even the most visible man in America could be silenced with such precision that not a shred of him remained. For the FBI, the Hoffa case became a cautionary tale. It reminded them that even with all the resources of the federal government, some secrets were too well guarded, some crimes too perfectly executed. The agents who had chased the case for years retired, passing it on to younger men and women who inherited not a mystery but a legend. By the dawn of the 21st century, Hoffa's name had transcended the investigation itself. He was no longer just a labor leader or a mob target, he was an American myth. His disappearance lived in jokes, in films, in novels, in whispered stories at bars. The law had spoken, declaring him dead, but the mystery remained alive, defying closure. The relentless hunt, with all its searches and theories, left behind not answers but echoes. Hoffa was everywhere and nowhere, in the rumors of construction workers, in the confessions of dying mobsters, in the frustrated files of the FBI. His absence became a presence, larger than life, a puzzle that law and order could not solve. And so, the story of Hoffa's disappearance settled into history not with clarity but with silence. The silence of witnesses who never spoke. The silence of a body never found. The silence of a man declared dead on paper but alive in legend. It was this silence, more than anything else, that ensured Jimmy Hoffa would never truly fade. By the time Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982, his story had already left the realm of fact and entered the domain of legend. Unlike most crime bosses or labor leaders, Hoffa's fate was not written in full but left suspended in mystery. And it is this mystery, this void where truth should reside, that transformed Hoffa from a historical figure into a cultural icon. America has always had a fascination with unsolved mysteries, from the vanishing of Amelia Earhart to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Yet Hoffa's case was different. He had not disappeared in the wilderness or fallen victim to a lone gunman. Instead, he was a man at the very heart of American power, union halls, mob negotiations, political dealings, who simply vanished from a suburban parking lot. It was as if history had erased him in broad daylight. The sheer audacity of it captured the imagination of an entire nation. Almost immediately, Hoffa jokes began circulating. They were dark, sardonic, and strangely affectionate. Check under the end zone at Giant Stadium, people would say when the subject of Hoffa arose. Others swore he was buried beneath highways or hidden in cement foundations of new skyscrapers. These jokes weren't merely attempts at humor, they were ways for the public to process a disappearance so profound that laughter became a balm for confusion. The idea of Hoffa as buried in concrete became a recurring theme, a metaphor for both mob ruthlessness and industrial America. Football games, construction projects, even highway work became fertile ground for speculation. Every time a new foundation was laid or a structure demolished, whispers would arise, could Hoffa be here? The man who once commanded the nation's truckers had become an eternal punchline, but also an eternal ghost, lurking beneath the surface of America's infrastructure. Writers and filmmakers quickly realized the narrative power of Hoffa's story. Hollywood, with its appetite for larger-than-life characters, embraced him as both a subject and a symbol. Books chronicling his life sold briskly, blending biography with speculation. Films like Hoffa, 1992, starring Jack Nicholson, brought his persona to the big screen, portraying him as a fiery leader undone by his alliances. More recently, Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, 2019, reintroduced Hoffa to a new generation, dramatizing his final days through the confessions of Frank Sheeran, a mob hitman who claimed to have been involved in Hoffa's murder. What made these portrayals so compelling was not just Hoffa's rise and fall but the gap in his story, the blank page at the end. Unlike other historical figures whose arcs were completed, Hoffa's remained open-ended, inviting endless reimagining. In films, he could die one way, in books, another. Each interpretation became less about historical certainty and more about cultural catharsis. The legend of Hoffa also influenced music, television, and even politics. Musicians referenced him in lyrics, often as shorthand for the underworld or for the working-class struggle. Television crime dramas borrowed elements of his story, weaving them into fictional mob narratives. Politicians invoked his name when discussing corruption, labor power, or the hidden hand of organized crime. Hoffa had become not just a man but a symbol, a cipher that could be adapted to fit whatever story America wanted to tell itself about power, ambition, and betrayal. Psychologically, Hoffa's disappearance played into a uniquely American fear, the idea that even the most powerful can vanish without explanation. In a nation built on transparency, contracts, and legal order, Hoffa represented the opposite, the shadows where deals were struck, where loyalty outweighed truth, where even federal investigations could yield no answers. To many, this made him frightening. To others, it made him strangely admirable, proof of his toughness, his ability to remain larger than the system even in death. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Hoffa's cultural impact is the way he continues to live in speculation. Decades after his disappearance, news outlets still run stories when a field is searched or a driveway dug up. Each time, the same cycle repeats: anticipation, media frenzy, disappointment. And yet, the public never tires of it. The idea that the mystery could finally be solved, this time for real, keeps Hoffa's story alive in a way few others manage. Children who never knew Hoffa in life grew up hearing his name in jokes and stories. For them, Hoffa was not a labor leader but a character out of folklore, part gangster, part ghost, part working-class hero. His name became shorthand for the unsolvable, the unknowable, the eternal what if. Just as sailors once spoke of the Flying Dutchman or treasure hunters of lost gold, Americans spoke of Jimmy Hoffa, forever missing, forever hidden. Academics and cultural historians have noted that Hoffa occupies a peculiar place in American mythology. He is not revered like a saint, nor condemned like a villain. Instead, he exists in a liminal space, respected for his power, pitted for his fall, and immortalized for his mystery. His story resonates because it mirrors the contradictions of America itself, the blend of ambition and corruption, democracy and secrecy, labor and crime. In classrooms, Hoffa's case is sometimes used to illustrate the limits of law enforcement, the dangers of organized crime, and the complexity of labor politics. In living rooms, his story remains dinner table conversation, sparked anew whenever a documentary or film revisits him. The duality of Hoffa, as both a man who built a union and a man consumed by shadows, ensures that he can be endlessly reinterpreted. Even today, in the digital age, Hoffa's mystery thrives online. Social media threads spin theories, YouTube videos re-examine evidence, podcasts retell his story in hushed, suspenseful tones. The case has adapted seamlessly to new platforms, proving its timelessness. Where other mysteries fade with time, Hoffa's grows, fed by speculation, storytelling, and the allure of the unknown. Ultimately, Hoffa's presence in American imagination demonstrates that myths do not require resolution. In fact, their power often lies in the lack of answers. If Hoffa's body were found tomorrow, the jokes would stop, the theories would end, and the mystery would finally rest. Yet, perhaps, something would be lost. For nearly half a century, Hoffa has been more than a man, he has been a question, one that America keeps asking because the asking itself has become part of the culture. In that sense, Jimmy Hoffa never truly vanished. His body may be gone, but his story remains embedded in jokes, in films, in whispered speculation. He is in the cement beneath stadiums, in the pages of books, in the glow of movie screens, in the archives of the FBI, and in the imagination of every person who has ever wondered how someone so powerful could disappear so completely. Hoffa's cultural afterlife is proof that legends are not born from certainty but from absence. And in that absence, Hoffa has found immortality. When we reflect on the story of Jimmy Hoffa, it is tempting to see only the mystery of his disappearance or the drama of his clashes with the government. Yet, before Hoffa became a legend of crime lore, he was first and foremost a labor leader, a man whose tireless organizing and shrewd negotiations reshaped the American workforce. His legacy is therefore not one of simple villainy or heroism, but of deep contradictions. To some, he was a savior of the working man. To others, he was a corrupt boss entangled with mobsters. The truth, like Hoffa himself, lies somewhere between. At the heart of Hoffa's legacy are his genuine achievements for the working class. In the mid-20th century, truck drivers often endured punishing hours for meager wages. Their jobs were grueling and unsafe, with little security and almost no benefits. Hoffa, drawing on his own experiences as a dock worker, understood this hardship intimately. He was not a distant bureaucrat but a leader who knew what it felt like to lift crates, drive long hauls, and face exploitative employers. This gave him credibility among workers who felt invisible to the powerful. Through relentless organizing, Hoffa turned the Teamsters into a national powerhouse. By the late 1950s, the union had grown into the largest in the United States, representing more than 1 million members. But Hoffa's vision extended further. He believed in the concept of a national master contract, a single agreement that would standardize wages, hours, and working conditions for truck drivers across the country. This was no small feat. It required uniting a fragmented industry with countless employers and regional divisions. In 1964, Hoffa achieved what many thought impossible, the National Master Freight Agreement. For the first time in history, truck drivers across America were guaranteed uniform pay and benefits, lifting countless families into a new standard of living. Wages rose significantly, health insurance and pensions became common, and the dignity of workers was affirmed. This agreement alone cemented Hoffa's reputation as one of the most effective labor leaders of the 20th century. Hoffa also believed in personal loyalty to his members. He was famous for remembering names, for showing up at picket lines, and for treating drivers with respect. To his men, he was not an abstract figure on television but a leader who cared. Stories circulated of Hoffa personally helping families in need, ensuring that his members felt both protected and valued. This loyalty flowed both ways. Workers adored him, often fiercely, even when accusations of corruption swirled around him. But Hoffa's legacy cannot be separated from the darker realities that accompanied these triumphs. His reliance on intimidation, strong-arm tactics, and mob alliances raised fundamental questions about whether his victories were achieved through justice or coercion. The partnerships he forged with organized crime allowed the Teamsters to grow powerful, but they also opened the door to corruption that tainted the union's reputation for decades. The Central States Pension Fund, one of Hoffa's greatest tools for union strength, also became a source of scandal. While it provided security for many workers, portions of it were siphoned into mob-controlled ventures. Millions of dollars were loaned to casinos, hotels, and construction projects tied to organized crime, enriching mobsters while putting workers' money at risk. To Hoffa, this was pragmatic, an alliance that kept the union strong. To critics, it was a betrayal of the very people he claimed to protect. Violence, too, was never far from Hoffa's orbit. Strikes and negotiations often carried the shadow of force. Employers who resisted union demands sometimes found themselves pressured not just by picket lines but by threats and beatings. Rival union leaders who challenged Hoffa's authority occasionally disappeared from the landscape, their silence speaking volumes. Hoffa's defenders argued that such tactics were necessary in a brutal labor climate, where bosses routinely exploited workers and hired strikebreakers. His critics countered that Hoffa blurred the line between defending labor and running a criminal enterprise. This duality, champion of workers, ally of mobsters, has made Hoffa's place in history uniquely complex. Scholars debate whether his achievements outweigh his compromises, or whether the compromises made the achievements possible. Could the National Master Freight Agreement have been won without the muscle of organized crime? Could the Teamsters have grown so vast without alliances forged in shadowy backrooms? These are questions that cannot be answered easily, and perhaps that is why Hoffa remains such a compelling figure. His legacy also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power. Hoffa's story suggests that in mid-century America, labor, business, politics, and organized crime were more deeply intertwined than many wanted to admit. He was not merely a rogue leader but a product of his environment, an environment where corruption was woven into the very fabric of industry and governance. His downfall, then, was not just personal but emblematic of a system that struggled to reconcile the needs of workers with the temptations of power. In the decades since Hoffa's disappearance, the Teamsters have sought to distance themselves from his shadow, reforming their image and curbing corruption. Yet Hoffa's name remains both a source of pride and embarrassment within the union. On one hand, older members recall him as the man who gave them pensions, fair wages, and dignity. On the other hand, his associations with mobsters serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. Among historians and labor scholars, Hoffa is increasingly recognized as one of the most influential labor leaders in American history. His methods may be questioned, but his impact is undeniable. He lifted millions of workers, redefined the trucking industry, and reshaped the labor landscape. Yet, he also contributed to the image of unions as corrupt and criminal, an image that opponents of organized labor have exploited for decades. In this sense, Hoffa's legacy is not only his own but also part of the broader struggle over how unions are perceived in America. Culturally, Hoffa's legacy is equally enduring. He is remembered not just as a union boss but as a larger-than-life figure, a man who embodied the contradictions of ambition, loyalty, and corruption. His disappearance has overshadowed much of his life's work, but for those who look closely, his achievements remain just as striking as his mystery. He was, at once, the protector of the working class and the embodiment of its compromises. For the American worker who remembers the better wages and benefits he fought for, Hoffa is a hero. For the reformer who values clean governance and transparency, he is a cautionary tale. For the storyteller, he is both, a man whose rise and fall speak to the complexity of power, the cost of loyalty, and the thin line between justice and corruption. In the end, Jimmy Hoffa's legacy resists simplification. He cannot be neatly filed away as either saint or sinner. He was both, and neither. His achievements lifted the working class, his compromises enriched the underworld, and his disappearance immortalized him in legend. His life reminds us that history is rarely clean-cut, that progress often comes entangled with shadows, and that sometimes, the very flaws of a leader are inseparable from their greatness. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance in 1975 had by now become one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Nearly 3 decades of public life had turned him into a household name, and when that name suddenly vanished, the void it left behind was filled with speculation, rumor, and half-truths. This section explores the aftermath of his disappearance, tracing the immediate shock, the official investigations, the tangled web of suspects, and the way the story continued to grow even as hard evidence remained frustratingly out of reach. At around 1,000 words, this moment is the heart of the mystery, the place where fact and legend collide, and where Jimmy Hoffa transforms from a man into a ghostly figure of American folklore. The initial hours after Hoffa failed to return from his supposed meeting with Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone were filled with confusion. His family reported him missing, and within days, the press latched onto the story. The disappearance of a man who had once been among the most powerful figures in the country was not something that could be hidden away. For the FBI, the case was both urgent and confounding. Agents fanned out across Detroit, searching for clues, canvassing restaurants, gas stations, and parking lots near the Machu's Red Fox restaurant where Hoffa was last seen. Yet, despite a massive effort, there was no body, no confirmed eyewitnesses of foul play, and no physical evidence that could point decisively to what had happened. The absence of evidence opened the door for theories, some grounded in plausible mafia politics, others drifting into the realm of the fantastic. One common thread suggested that Hoffa had been lured to the meeting by promises of resolving disputes over his return to power within the Teamsters. Provenzano, a tough New Jersey mobster, had a personal grudge against Hoffa, while Giacalone acted as a trusted intermediary with ties to Detroit's underworld. Both men had motive and opportunity, but no smoking gun. Some accounts claimed that Hoffa was driven away from the parking lot in a car belonging to a known mob associate. Others speculated he was forced into a vehicle at gunpoint, his protests silenced before he could draw attention. Yet, despite endless FBI wiretaps and informants, the trail always went cold just as it seemed to be heating up. Over time, the mystery deepened. Federal investigators strongly suspected the involvement of organized crime, especially given Hoffa's long history with mafia figures and his enemies within labor politics. But organized crime thrived on silence. The Code of Omerta, the mafia's rule of silence, ensured that even those who might have known the truth kept it buried. For decades, mob insiders occasionally dropped hints. Some said Hoffa was killed within hours, his body cremated in a mafia-controlled facility. Others claimed he was buried beneath the concrete of a new stadium, the construction of a bridge, or even beneath the floor of a suburban home. Each new rumor brought headlines, but none brought closure. For Hoffa's family, the years after his disappearance were agonizing. His wife, Josephine, waited with fading hope for word of his fate. His children, including James P. Hoffa, who would eventually rise to become Teamsters president himself, were forced to navigate life under the shadow of their father's ghost. For them, the speculation was not entertainment, but a wound that refused to heal. Each new theory reopened the pain, reminding them of the man who had walked out the door one July afternoon and never returned. The FBI investigation formally labeled Hoffa as missing, presumed dead, but prosecutors were never able to bring charges. Provenzano, Giacalone, and other suspects faced scrutiny, yet most took the secret to their graves. Over time, the government admitted that solving the case had become unlikely. Without a body, without clear forensic evidence, the case was destined to linger as one of America's great unsolved mysteries. And yet, the disappearance had consequences beyond Hoffa himself. It reshaped the Teamsters, forced federal oversight into the Union, and underscored the power of the mafia during the 1970s. It also altered the cultural image of organized crime. The idea that a man as visible, as famous, and as powerful as Jimmy Hoffa could be made to vanish without a trace spoke volumes about the reach of the underworld. If Hoffa could be silenced, anyone could. That fear helped fuel the fascination that continues to this day. By the 1980s and 1990s, Hoffa's story became as much myth as history. His name appeared in films, novels, and countless conspiracy theories. Excavations were carried out in backyards and construction sites based on tips, but they always ended in disappointment. Each time investigators thought they were close to the truth, the ground yielded nothing. Still, the speculation never stopped, because the mystery itself had become larger than any solution. As time moved on, the possibility of ever learning the truth diminished. Most of the key figures were either dead or unwilling to talk. For many, Hoffa's disappearance became a parable about ambition, power, and betrayal. His life had been one of relentless struggle, building an empire within the Teamsters, defying both corporations and the government. Yet, in the end, the man who had been larger than life disappeared as though swallowed by the earth itself. In this way, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was not just a crime, it was a transformation. A living man became a mystery, a name became a legend, and a question mark became permanent. Whether buried under a stadium, dissolved in acid, or burned in secrecy, Hoffa's final chapter has never been written. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Mystery has a way of capturing the imagination, and in Hoffa's case, the silence around his fate became the loudest part of his legacy. Jimmy Hoffa's life, disappearance, and enduring legacy form a story that blends history, crime, politics, and myth into a single narrative that continues to captivate people half a century later. This final section does not seek to solve the mystery, for no one has, but instead reflects on why the story of Hoffa has remained alive for so long, and why it continues to find its way into books, documentaries, films, and late-night conversations. At around 1,000 words, this closing chapter is a meditation, designed to gently guide listeners into thought and reflection, bringing the journey to a calm but meaningful conclusion. The story of Jimmy Hoffa begins in working-class Michigan, where a boy learned early the value of toughness and the power of loyalty. It rose into the bustling factories and smoky union halls of the 1940s and 1950s, where he transformed himself into a voice for the American worker. It took him into the political spotlight, a man who could shake hands with presidents yet speak the language of dockworkers and truck drivers. It also led him into darker partnerships, handshakes with mobsters, and deals made in quiet backrooms where loyalty was fragile and betrayal was a constant threat. His rise was meteoric, his fall dramatic, and his disappearance legendary. Yet through it all, Jimmy Hoffa remains more than just a missing person. He has become a symbol. What is that symbol, though? For some, Hoffa represents the great power of organized labor, a man who dared to challenge corporations and the federal government on behalf of workers. To others, he is a cautionary tale about ambition, corruption, and the dangerous dance with organized crime. Still others see him as an American archetype, the scrappy fighter who climbed to the top, only to vanish at the hands of forces even he could not control. Like any enduring legend, Hoffa's meaning shifts depending on who is telling the story and what lens they view him through. In the decades since his disappearance, the search for answers has often been less about Hoffa himself and more about the society that remembers him. Each new excavation, every FBI tip-off, each whispered story from a retired mobster is less about finding bones and more about keeping alive the idea that one day, we might know the truth. But the truth, as it so often does, seems to resist capture. Hoffa's body has never been found, and perhaps it never will be. That absence, that permanent question mark, has become part of the legend. The silence speaks louder than any discovery could. In popular culture, Hoffa has taken on a life of his own. He has been portrayed by great actors, written into novels, and referenced in comedy sketches. His name has become shorthand for the unsolved, the mysterious, the vanished. Where's Hoffa? Is a question that needs no explanation in America. It is part of the cultural fabric, an illusion that everyone understands even if they do not know the details. That level of recognition is rare. Very few people ascend to the kind of mythic status where their absence becomes more powerful than their presence. The Hoffa mystery also speaks to something deeper about human psychology. We are drawn to mysteries, particularly those without neat conclusions. The unanswered question keeps the story alive, allowing each generation to revisit it, reinterpret it, and make it their own. Just as the lost colony of Roanoke, the vanishing of Amelia Earhart, or the fate of D.B. Cooper continues to fascinate, so too does Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance hold us. It is not simply about crime or politics, it is about the allure of the unknown, the story that refuses to end. For the Teamsters Union, Hoffa's legacy is complex. His son, James P. Hoffa, eventually followed in his footsteps, becoming president of the Teamsters decades later. The union itself has continued to evolve, moving past its darkest chapters but never escaping the shadow of Jimmy Hoffa entirely. Among workers, some still view him with affection, a man who fought tooth and nail for better wages and working conditions. Others remember him as the leader whose entanglements with the mob brought unwanted attention and long-lasting consequences. That duality is central to understanding Hoffa. He was both a champion and a cautionary tale. And so, when we reflect on his story, we are left with a portrait of a man who embodied both the best and the worst of American ambition. He was fiercely loyal yet capable of ruthless calculation. He was admired by millions and feared by many. He was a symbol of empowerment for workers, yet also a man who chose to build alliances with criminals. His life is a reminder that greatness often walks hand in hand with danger, and that the pursuit of power can take us to heights we never imagined, and risks we may never escape. As the years pass, the mystery of Hoffa's disappearance may eventually fade. Perhaps one day a discovery will be made that answers the lingering questions once and for all. Or perhaps the truth will remain forever buried, known only to those who are themselves long gone. But whether the answer is found or not, the story will continue to live. Because in the end, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is not just about one man, it is about the way stories can transcend time, the way mysteries can take root in the collective imagination, and the way history is shaped not only by what we know, but also by what we may never know. As we close this journey, imagine Jimmy Hoffa not only as the union boss, the fighter, the negotiator, or even the missing man. Imagine him as a character etched into the larger story of America, a land where ambition can lift a man from humble beginnings to dizzying heights, where power can be both a shield and a trap, and where sometimes, the greatest stories are those without an ending. Hoffa's life was full of noise, speeches, rallies, court battles, and confrontations. But his legacy, curiously, rests in silence, the silence of the unanswered question. And perhaps that silence is fitting. For in silence, the mind wanders. In silence, the imagination stirs. And in silence, stories live on long after the final chapter should have ended. Hoffa's story is not complete, and maybe it never will be. But in that incompleteness lies its power, a lullaby of mystery, ambition, and the shadows of history. A story we can return to, again and again, even as we drift into sleep, still wondering, whatever happened to Jimmy Hoffa?